Hey guys, today we're going to step way back in time. Close your eyes for a moment if you like, and imagine a world where your refrigerator is just, well, a rock-lined cave. Your grocery store. The unforgiving, mysterious wilderness. You trudge through dense undergrowth, the damp earth squelching underfoot, your stomach growling with a hunger so primal it hums a low, insistent tune in your ears. Every rustle, every glint of an unfamiliar berry sends a jolt of both hope and dread through you. Because in this ancient world, a single bite of the wrong thing isn't just a bad afternoon. It's a permanent dirt nap. You probably wouldn't survive a week, let alone a lifetime, navigating the culinary minefield our ancestors bravely, or perhaps foolishly, traversed. And it's this perilous, delicious gamble that sets the stage for our story, a tale about a fruit, or a vegetable, depending on who you ask, that everyone now loves but once feared as a harbinger of death. The humble tomato. Now when you picture a tomato, you probably see a plump, juicy orb nestled in your salad, or bubbling merrily in a rich pasta sauce. But for millennia, this vibrant red wonder was shrouded in a cloak of suspicion, a notorious member of a botanical rogues gallery known as the nightshade family, the Solanaceae. Imagine a family reunion where half your relatives are perfectly charming, like potatoes, eggplants, and bell peppers, while the other half are absolute botanical psychopaths. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, with its glistening, dark berries, looks deceptively enticing, doesn't it? It's the kind of plant that whispers sweet nothings of death into the ears of unsuspecting foragers. Then there's mandrake, a root so steeped in folklore and fear that it was said to shriek when pulled from the ground, a sound that could drive a person mad or even kill them. And henbane, another cousin, used historically in dark rituals and as a potent poison, capable of inducing hallucinations and a horrifying paralysis. These were not plants you casually snacked on. You understood innately that their beauty often masked a sinister secret. So, when something new popped up, something that shared the telltale structural similarities, the star-shaped flower, the sometimes unsettling leaf patterns of these known botanical baddies, ancient humans didn't exactly line up for a taste test. Their survival instinct was finely tuned. If it looked like a duck and quacked like a duck, and occasionally caused your neighbor to spontaneously combust after eating it, you probably kept your distance. For our ancestors, every unfamiliar plant was a potential assassin, lurking with hidden toxins. It's why so much of early human knowledge was based on painstaking, often fatal, trial and error. Hey, ugh, try this weird red berry. No, don't worry. My cousin only started foaming at the mouth for a few hours. It was a high-stakes game of botanical roulette, and you can hardly blame them for being a tad cautious. The tomato, or as it was known in its earliest European encounters, the wolf peach, Lycopersicum esculentum, certainly didn't do itself any favors with its name. Wolf peach. Doesn't that just sound like something a medieval witch would use to summon minor demons, rather than a delicious topping for pizza? The wolf part was a nod to its perceived wildness, its dangerous, untamed nature, often associated with wolves, which were, of course, predators and symbols of the untamed wilderness. And peach, well, it resembled a peach, albeit a rather unsettling one with its smooth, plump skin. The name itself was a warning sign, a scarlet letter branded upon its innocent, albeit nightshade-affiliated, flesh. You can almost hear the hushed whispers of peasants, eyes wide, pointing at the unusual red fruit. Beware the wolf's peach, it twists the guts. This primal fear wasn't entirely unfounded. The nightshade family is united by the presence of potent alkaloids. complex organic compounds that can seriously mess with your nervous system. Belladonna has atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamin, all of which are powerful anticholinergics that can lead to delirium, hallucinations, and cardiac arrest. The tomato, for all its modern culinary glory, also contains solanine, a glycocalloid, though in much smaller, generally harmless quantities, primarily in its leaves and stems and in unripe green fruits. But back then, they didn't have chemical analysis labs, did they? They had their gut feelings, their shared generational wisdom, often derived from tragedy, and a healthy dose of superstition. If a plant could make you trip out or drop dead, it was evil, plain, and simple. Imagine yourself a settler in 16th century Europe, encountering this vibrant, alien fruit brought back from the New World. It's red, which is often a warning sign in nature, think poisonous frogs or berries. It looks a bit like some of the deadly European nightshades. And when some adventurous or desperate soul tries it and gets a stomachache, perhaps from eating an unripe one, or simply from the unfamiliarity, boom, confirmation bias kicks in. See, I told you it was poison. Good thing I stuck to my gruel. You can almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the cautious ones. It's funny, isn't it, how readily we accept a negative narrative when it confirms our existing fears. Historians still argue whether the initial fear of the tomato was purely botanical, or if its association with the poor, who sometimes ate it out of necessity despite the warnings, further cemented its reputation as a peasant's poison. Perhaps it was a combination of both. After all, if the wealthy elite weren't eating it, it must be bad for you, right? Such snobbery has permeated food culture for centuries. It's a bit like how some people used to look down on lobster as poor man's protein before it became a luxury item. The tomato endured a similar, though far more dangerous, reputational struggle. Its journey from dangerous wolf peach to everyday pantry staple is a testament to human curiosity, and perhaps our inherent stubbornness when it comes to deliciousness. You're wandering through a sun-dappled botanical garden in 16th century Europe. The air is thick, not just with the scent of blossoming roses and damp earth, but with an undercurrent of something else, an unspoken apprehension. You, as a curious soul of this era, might stoop to admire a vibrant, peculiar plant, its leaves a rich green, its fruit a startling, inviting red. Yet in this age, beauty often masked peril, because if you were a true botanist of the time, venturing beyond the known, classifying the new, you'd probably be dead. Not from a duel or a plague, but from accidentally tasting something you shouldn't. The botanical world then was less a tranquil sanctuary and more a perilous puzzle, where one misidentified leaf, one seemingly harmless berry, could usher in an excruciating end. This grim reality kept the most intrepid minds cautious, their senses finely tuned to the subtle whispers of danger hidden within the flora. And among the loudest of those whispers was the word nightshade. See, this captivating red fruit, the one we now casually slice onto our pizzas and dice into our salsas, belongs to the Solanaceae family. It's a botanical clan with a reputation so dark, so steeped in folklore and fear, that just mentioning its name could send shivers down a seasoned herbalist's spine. Think of it like this. If plant families were Hollywood dynasties, the Solanaceae would be the Addams family. You've got your sweet, quirky members, sure, but then you have the ones who are just naturally inclined towards the macabre. The tomato, surprisingly, found itself seated at the dinner table with some truly unsettling relatives. Among these relatives, the stars of the botanical horror show included deadly nightshade itself, Atropa belladonna. Its name, beautiful lady, comes from the chilling practice of women using its extracts to dilate their pupils, achieving a wide-eyed, almost ethereal look, though often at the cost of blurred vision, hallucinations, and, eventually, a descent into oblivion. Then there's mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, with its gnarly, human-like root. Folklore swore it shrieked when pulled from the ground, and that its touch brought madness or death. Imagine tending your garden, digging up a mandrake, and hearing a tiny, horrifying scream. Not exactly relaxing, is it? And let's not forget henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a plant notorious for its use in ancient potions and medieval witchcraft, capable of inducing delirium and a waking nightmare. What these plants all shared, what bound them in their sinister kinship, were potent chemical compounds called alkaloids. These aren't just any chemicals. These are nature's little secret weapons: atropine, scopolamine, hyoscyamin. Complex organic molecules designed to interfere with nervous systems, capable of causing convulsions, cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, and an irreversible, permanent kind of calm. It's the botanical equivalent of a do not touch, sign written in bold, capital letters, with a skull and crossbones for good measure. So, when specimens of this new plant from the Americas began arriving in European botanical gardens and apothecaries, a plant with eerily familiar flower structures, a similar five-lobed calyx formation, and leaves that hinted at its dangerous lineage, the alarm bells rang. Botanists of the era, operating with the best knowledge available to them, relied heavily on morphological similarities. They observed, drew, and categorized based on what they saw. And what they saw in the tomato was a spitting image of its toxic kin. Even centuries later, when Carl Linnaeus, the brilliant Swedish botanist who gave us our modern system of binomial nomenclature, formally classified the tomato, he placed it squarely within the Solanum genus. That's the very same genus that houses Solanum nigrum, the common black nightshade, and many other plants with a dubious, if not outright deadly, reputation. This wasn't merely a taxonomic label. It was a brand, a permanent scarlet letter affirming its dangerous connections, solidifying a suspicion that had taken root long before Linnaeus's time. It was as if the tomato arrived with a family tree that had a very prominent "Do Not Disturb" sign on one of its most important branches. The implications of this botanical kinship were profound. If the learned men of science, the very experts on plants, declared this new fruit a relative of death, then who were the common folk to argue? The fear wasn't confined to academic circles. It seeped into the public consciousness, shaping culinary choices and agricultural practices. Farmers were reluctant, understandably so, of cultivating a plant that looked suspiciously like a known poison. Imagine trying to convince your neighbors to eat something that visually resembled the very thing responsible for the most agonizing deaths in their community. You'd be laughed out of the village square, if not outright condemned. In an age devoid of sophisticated chemical analysis, where symptoms of poisoning were often mistaken for curses or divine retribution, direct observation was paramount. If your neighbor consumed a strange red fruit, similar in appearance to those plants whose touch brought illness, and then subsequently wasted away, your natural, entirely logical conclusion would be poison. And perhaps, for the sake of survival, you'd be right to avoid it. It's easy for us, resting comfortably in our modern world of food safety regulations and detailed ingredient labels, to scoff at such apparent naivety. But put yourself in their worn leather shoes, facing an unknown edible that visually mimicked the very plants that could steal your breath. Your instinct, quite rightly, would scream danger. And as if the direct botanical link wasn't enough, folklore and fringe theories added layers to the fear. There are whispers in forgotten botanical journals, a quirky tidbit often overlooked, that suggested some early, more speculative herbalists proposed a truly bizarre idea, that the tomato, with its robust growth and seemingly uncanny vigor, might actually absorb and concentrate poisons from the very soil it grew in. Rather than being inherently toxic, this theory posited the tomato as a kind of natural, leafy sponge for doom, drawing up the earth's nefarious essences and storing them, like a vibrant red chemical spill, within its inviting fruit. So it wasn't just dangerous. It was a biohazard warning in berry form, a botanical filter that made itself inedible by design. Naturally, this didn't exactly boost its culinary appeal. Who wants to eat a fruit that's essentially a tiny, delicious, toxic waste dump, however pretty it might look? It was just one more layer of distrust, cementing the belief that this alluring newcomer was best admired from afar, perhaps from behind a very sturdy fence. This deep-seated distrust, born from sound botanical observation, even if incomplete, combined with the era's inherent anxieties about the unknown, cast a long, ominous shadow over the tomato. Historians still argue whether the initial fear of the tomato was primarily driven by true, albeit nascent, botanical understanding, or if it was more deeply rooted in pre-existing cultural anxieties about unknown foods and foreign imports. Was it purely science, or a healthy dose of xenophobia dressed up in academic robes? We can only ponder, but one thing is unequivocally clear. For centuries, if you ever encountered a European offering you a wolf peach for dessert, or casually suggesting you nibble on a love apple, your safest bet was to politely decline. Because while you, with your modern knowledge, understand the tomato's innocent delights, they, peering through the lens of ancient fears and limited science, probably envisioned it as the very last meal you'd ever eat. The pervasive, profound suspicion born from its botanical kinship clung to the tomato like a shadow, delaying its journey from garden curiosity to culinary staple. A journey that was, for a very long time, overshadowed by its notorious family tree. You stand on the bustling docks of Seville, the air thick with salt and exotic spices. A ship, recently returned from the vast, mysterious lands across the ocean, unloads its treasures. Among the barrels of gold, shimmering silks, and strange animals, you spot something peculiar, a plant, unlike any you've ever seen. Its leaves are broad, its stem thick, and hanging from its branches are clusters of fruit, some green, some yellow, and some a startling, vivid red. It looks almost too perfect, too intensely colored to be natural, a suspicious jewel in the botanical crown, a vibrant warning sign in a world already wary of the unknown. This peculiar specimen, this New World fruit, carried across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, was the tomato. Its journey to European shores was less a grand triumphal parade, and more a slow, hesitant tiptoe through the back door of botanical curiosity. Early explorers and colonists, encountering it in the Americas, certainly recognized its edibility among the indigenous peoples. But bringing it back to a Europe steeped in centuries of plant lore and rigid classifications was an entirely different matter. Imagine trying to convince your great-aunt that the sparkly, somewhat alien-looking mushroom you just found in the woods is, in fact, delicious. That was the scale of the challenge for the humble tomato. Its initial reception across Europe was, to put it mildly, frosty. When it first arrived in places like Spain and Italy in the mid-16th century, it wasn't destined for the cooking pot. Oh no. It was destined for the decorative garden, often nestled amongst other exotic plants that were more admired for their unusual forms or vibrant hues than for any culinary promise. You'd find it in the grand botanical gardens of nobility or universities, a botanical oddity rather than a culinary staple. Think of it as the fancy, slightly alarming new art installation at a gallery. Everyone looks, everyone murmurs, but no one dares to actually touch it, let alone consume it. The very color of the ripe fruit, that audacious red, was a significant barrier. In the European folk wisdom of the time, bright red often signaled danger, poison. Berries of deadly nightshade, for instance, were a similar hue. And as we discussed, the tomato's botanical kinship with those infamous plants didn't exactly inspire confidence. European botanists, painstakingly trying to categorize the influx of new species from the Americas, often placed the tomato right alongside its toxic cousins, sometimes even labeling it Solanum lycopersicum, the wolf peach, a name that conjured images of sinister forests and swift, agonizing ends. It wasn't exactly an appetizing moniker, was it? You can almost hear the whispered warnings among the gardeners. Don't touch the wolf peach, good sir, unless you fancy a quick trip to the afterlife. For many years, the tomato was simply an ornamental curiosity. Wealthy landowners would cultivate it for its exotic beauty, displaying its vibrant fruit on trellises and in conservatories. It was a status symbol, a conversation piece, but never food. Picture a lavish dinner party where the centerpieces are bowls brimming with these beautiful, forbidden fruits, artfully arranged to be admired, not eaten. One can almost hear the host proudly declaring, "And these, my dear guests, are my prized love apples. Absolutely stunning, wouldn't you agree? Though of course you wouldn't eat them. One simply observes their vibrant menace." That was probably a common sentiment. Now here's where the kinda right part of the story truly bites. While the tomato itself isn't inherently poisonous, many affluent Europeans of the era ate off pewter plates. This was a common practice among the aristocracy and wealthy merchant class. Pewter, unfortunately, contains a significant amount of lead. When the highly acidic tomato came into contact with these lead-heavy plates, it would leach the lead out of the pewter. People would then ingest this lead, suffering from lead poisoning, which manifested with symptoms like stomach upset, vomiting, and eventually, death. And because the common folk weren't using such fancy and deadly dinnerware, they weren't getting sick from the tomatoes. The correlation seemed clear. Only the rich who ate these poisonous fruits succumbed to strange ailments. So they naturally blamed the tomato. If you had been dining with the elite back then, you probably wouldn't have survived the experience, at least not if you sampled the poisonous new fruit. It wasn't the tomato's fault, of course, but try telling that to someone writhing in agony, attributing their demise to a pretty red berry. This tragic misunderstanding solidified the tomato's reputation as a dangerous, inedible plant for centuries in many parts of Europe. While some brave souls in southern Italy, likely less encumbered by lead plates and perhaps more open to new tastes from their connection to the Mediterranean and North Africa, began to slowly integrate it into their cuisine, the broader European populace remained deeply suspicious. Historians still argue whether the initial spread of the tomato in Italy was primarily from Spanish influence or through separate trade routes and early experimentation. But what's clear is that it was a painstaking, almost imperceptible creep into the kitchen, rather than a bold leap. The journey of the tomato from fascinating garden specimen to kitchen staple was less a sprint and more an incredibly long, very cautious crawl. You're seated at a grand dining table, the kind where the silverware alone probably costs more than your entire apartment. Chandeliers drip with a warm, buttery light, reflecting off polished oak and the heavy, brocaded silks of the gentlemen and ladies around you. A hush falls as the next course is presented, and your eyes, accustomed to the muted greens and browns of typical European fare, are suddenly confronted with an anomaly. There, nestled on a platter, are these curious, plump, intensely red orbs. They glow with an almost unnatural vibrancy against the dull gleam of the pewter plates laid before each distinguished guest. You can practically hear the collective intake of breath, a subtle rustle of silk and quiet whispers. This isn't just a new dish. It's a test, a daring culinary foray into the unknown, a challenge to the very superstitions that have held sway for generations. You might find yourself reaching for a goblet of wine, just for a little liquid courage, because, let's be honest, you probably won't survive this. These are the wolf peaches, remember. The very plants you've been told for years, perhaps even centuries, could send you straight to the grave with a single bite. But now, in the gilded halls of European aristocracy, a few brave, or perhaps foolish, souls are about to put that fear to the ultimate test. They've heard whispers from across the Atlantic, tales of these Palm d'Oro being eaten in warmer lands, and curiosity, as it often does, is proving a powerful and potentially dangerous motivator. One brave duke, or perhaps a flamboyant marquis, with a flourish that belies the trepidation in his eyes, reaches out. He slices into the glossy skin of one of these forbidden fruits. The scent is unexpectedly earthy, a little sweet unlike anything familiar. He lifts a piece to his lips, and a ripple of hushed anticipation runs through the room. A slight chew, a thoughtful swallow, and then nothing. Not immediate death, not a sudden transformation into a toad. Just a curious, slightly tangy taste. A small, relieved sigh collectively escapes the room, and soon others, encouraged by this initial success, follow suit. For a brief, shining moment, it seems the fear was unfounded. The tomato, this vibrant newcomer, is a harmless, perhaps even delicious, addition to the aristocratic table. But then the strange afflictions begin. Not immediately, not with the dramatic flair of a Shakespearean poison, but subtly, insidiously. Days later, a prominent countess, who had so gleefully savored the exotic fruit, begins to complain of severe stomach pains. Her skin takes on an ashen pallor. Her limbs ache with a mysterious fatigue. She grows weak, disoriented, and eventually, many fall critically ill, some even succumbing to their ailments. Then another, a wealthy merchant, suffers similar symptoms. And another, a celebrated general. The pattern is undeniable. Those who dared to embrace the wolf peach are now suffering from a malady that baffles the most esteemed physicians of the era. The conclusion, to the minds of the 18th century European elite, is inescapable and terrifyingly logical. The tomato itself is poisonous. It's an undeniable truth, proven by the very bodies of the highest strata of society. Why else would only the wealthy, those daring to try this new fruit, be falling ill? The irony, of course, is that the tomato was not the culprit. Not truly. The true silent assassin lurked beneath the very food itself, the dinnerware. Wealthy Europeans of this period commonly dined on pewter plates, which were often made with a high lead content. When the highly acidic tomato, with its juicy, tart flesh, was placed on these lead-based plates, it would leach the lead from the dinnerware. This, my sleepy friend, was a recipe for disaster, or more accurately, for lead poisoning. Symptoms like stomach pains, nausea, fatigue and even death were textbook signs of chronic lead toxicity. Imagine the grand feasts, the elaborate meals meticulously prepared by skilled chefs, only to have the very plates upon which the food was served slowly, imperceptibly poison the diners. It's a bit like buying a luxurious, bespoke suit, only to discover it's woven with itching powder. You look great, but you're miserable. This widespread, albeit misunderstood, affliction among the nobility cemented the tomato's dreadful reputation. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a deadly, proven fact. The poor, who primarily ate from wooden trenchers or ceramic bowls, were largely spared this particular aristocratic ailment, which further reinforced the idea that the tomato was an elite poison, reserved for those wealthy enough to encounter it in this specific lethal combination. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in the tomato's toxicity was solely due to lead poisoning, or if lingering superstitions about nightshades played an equally significant role in delaying its acceptance. Perhaps it was a perfect storm of ancient fear meeting a modern, albeit unrecognized, hazard. Either way, the tomato, this vibrant fruit from the New World, was condemned as a killer, banished from the dinner tables of the polite society, and relegated to the status of an ornamental curiosity for almost another century. The fear of the wolf peach had found its deadly justification, not in its own nature, but in the very tools of civilization. And so, the innocent tomato became a scapegoat, blamed for the very illnesses its acidic juices, combined with lead, truly caused. You're invited to a lavish dinner party, a grand affair in a sprawling European manner. Chandeliers glitter, reflecting off polished wood and the gleam of metal on the table. You take your seat, an eager anticipation in the air. The talk is of new tastes, exotic imports, and daring culinary experiments. A servant glides by, presenting a platter piled high with those vibrant, ruby-red fruits, tomatoes. You eye them warily, remembering the whispers, the stories of illness that have circulated through the noble houses, stories that you now know. You watch as your host, a baron of considerable means and even more considerable pride, spears a slice with a flourish and brings it to his lips. He chews, savoring the novel tang, entirely oblivious to the silent, invisible danger unfolding right there, under his nose. And let's be honest, if you were there, with that particular combination of daring palate and privileged dinnerware, you probably wouldn't survive this particular culinary adventure. The Baron, like so many of his wealthy contemporaries, isn't dining off earthenware, nor off the relatively safer silver that was reserved for only the grandest occasions. No, his table is set with magnificent pewter. Think heavy, lustrous plates, tankards, and serving dishes, a mark of status that wasn't quite royal, but certainly far above the common clay. Pewter, you see, was the go-to metal for the well-to-do for centuries. It was durable, it looked impressive, and it was affordable enough for widespread use among the gentry, establishing itself as the chic tableware of its day. But here's the rub, a rather weighty metallic rub. This wasn't the lead-free pewter you might find in a quaint antique shop today. Oh no, this was the good stuff, the classic formula, which for a very long time included a generous helping of lead. We're talking anywhere from 5 to 40% lead, often more. A real chef's kiss of slow, agonizing death. Now, picture that perfectly ripe tomato bursting with its vibrant, juicy acidity. When that acidity met the lead in the pewter, a silent, chemical dance began. The tomato, bless its heart, was simply doing what acidic foods do. It was leaching the lead right out of the tableware. Think of it like this. Acids, as you might recall from a rather dull chemistry class you snoozed through, are excellent at breaking down certain substances. And lead, while seemingly robust, is surprisingly susceptible to acidic attack, especially when it's present in an alloy like pewter. So when that gloriously red, highly acidic tomato juice met the lead-rich surface of the plate, it wasn't just a casual hello. It was a full-on chemical embrace, with the lead being gently but persistently coaxed out of its metallic matrix. This wasn't an instantaneous, dramatic reaction that would make your soup glow in the dark, much to the dismay of any budding alchemists at the table. No, it was a subtle, prolonged process. The longer the tomato, or any other acidic food like certain fruits or vinegary sauces, remained in contact with the pewter, the more lead ions were released, silently, invisibly, into the meal. You might as well have been sprinkling lead shavings on your salad, which, if you think about it, is a rather metallic garnish. Slowly, insidiously, with every bite, with every serving, tiny particles of lead were dissolving into the food. The longer the food sat on the plate, the more lead it absorbed. So, if you were a particularly slow eater, savoring your tomato carpaccio over an hour-long conversation about the latest court intrigue, you were essentially enjoying a prolonged lead infusion. This wasn't a sudden, dramatic poisoning, not like a quick gulp of arsenic. This was a slow, cumulative, chronic poisoning, building up in the body over weeks, months, sometimes even years. And the symptoms. Well, remember those aristocratic afflictions you heard about in the last section. Vomiting, diarrhea, joint pain, confusion, anemia, paralysis, a general malaise that doctors couldn't quite put their finger on. They mirrored the very signs of lead poisoning. The wealthy, with their refined tastes and equally refined tableware, were inadvertently poisoning themselves with every sophisticated meal featuring this new, daring fruit. It was a cruel twist of fate, almost a cosmic joke. The very symbol of their elevated status, the fancy pewter, was betraying them. For centuries, doctors were baffled by these seemingly random outbreaks of illness among the wealthy. They prescribed purgatives, bled patients, applied leeches, all the greatest hits of pre-modern medicine. None of which, as you can probably guess, did anything to stop the slow creep of lead poisoning. There was no concept of heavy metal toxicity, no understanding of biomagnification, nothing to connect the dots between that gleaming dinner plate and the agonizing gut pain. They were looking for external causes, a miasma, a curse, a divine punishment, never suspecting the very utensils used to convey sustenance were the instruments of quiet suffering. It's like trying to find a ghost in your house, when the real problem is a leaky faucet in the basement, steadily rotting the foundation. This widespread issue highlights a mainstream historical fact. Lead was ubiquitous in European society for centuries. It wasn't just in pewter. It was in water pipes, lining wine barrels, which led to chronic lead poisoning among some vintners and drinkers, used in cosmetics to whiten skin, and as a sweetener for wine in some unscrupulous practices, a practice called sugaring wine with lead acetate. It was even used in paints, particularly white lead paint, which children were known to chew on, adding another layer to the silent epidemic. The Industrial Revolution, ironically, would only exacerbate this, with increased lead smelting and its use in various new products. You could barely turn a corner without bumping into lead, which, in hindsight, explains a lot about the general health, and perhaps even the irritable dispositions of some historical figures. Maybe it wasn't just the tight corsets after all. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of the more paranoid members of society, witnessing these illnesses, didn't just blame the tomato. They occasionally blamed the silver cutlery. They believed the tomato's poison was so potent it was reacting with the precious metal, turning it black. Of course, that was just the acidity of the tomato tarnishing the silver, a perfectly normal chemical reaction. But in an age of scientific ignorance and rampant superstition, it only added to the mystique of the deadly fruit. Imagine the poor household staff, polishing away furiously, trying to make the silver pristine again, while the real villain sat smugly, gleaming on the dinner table. Meanwhile, the vast majority of Europeans, the common folk, were largely spared from this particular culinary curse. Why? Because they simply couldn't afford lead-laced pewter. Their meals were served on wooden trenchers, ceramic bowls, or perhaps, if they were really pushing the boat out, rough earthenware. These materials, while certainly less glamorous and prone to splintering or chipping, were largely lead-free. So, while the nobility struggled with mysterious ailments, convinced the tomato was a demonic fruit, or a wolf peach come to life, the peasants, eating their meager fare off simple, honest wood, were unknowingly enjoying their tomatoes in perfect, albeit rough, health. They probably thought the aristocrats were just being delicate, or perhaps cursed by some disgruntled witch, never realizing the irony that their poverty was, in this one specific instance, their very best defense against an insidious poison. Historians still argue whether the widespread nature of lead poisoning from pewter alone was enough to fully explain the depth of fear surrounding tomatoes, or if other factors, like general dietary ignorance and the inherent wariness of new foods, played a more dominant role in keeping the fruit off European plates for so long. There's no simple answer, of course, because history, much like your grade dance secret ingredient, is always more complicated than it seems. The stage was set, not for a confrontation between man and fruit, but between man and his own unwitting practices. You're at the opulent table, the clinking of cutlery a delicate counterpoint to the hushed conversations echoing through the grand dining hall. A splash of rich, crimson sauce adorns your pewter plate, nestled beside a succulent roast. The aroma of herbs, garlic, and that distinctly fruity, yet subtly earthy scent of the tomato wafts up to you. You lift the fork, a perfectly ripe piece impaled, glistening under the candlelight. This, you think, is progress. This is the avant-garde. This is defying superstition. You chew slowly, savoring the burst of flavor, the unexpected sweetness balanced by a lively tang. A tiny, almost imperceptible metallic note dances on your tongue, but you dismiss it as the taste of the fork itself, or perhaps the robust character of the dish. After all, you're an aristocrat. You eat from fine pewter. This is how things are done. But here's the rub, literally and figuratively. You probably won't survive this meal unscathed. Not because the tomato is inherently evil, as many of your contemporaries still believe, but because of the silent, invisible war being waged on the surface of your very expensive dinnerware. It's a chemical dance, an unwitting tango between your progressive palate and the prevailing technology of the age. Remember that exquisite pewter, heavy and gleaming, a symbol of status and wealth. Unlike your common peasant, forced to eat from crude wooden trenchers or, heaven forbid, plain ceramic, your nobility affords you the luxury of an alloy, primarily tin, but crucially often significant amounts of lead. This wasn't some malevolent plot by ancient metallurgists. Lead was cheap, it was malleable, it lowered the melting point of the alloy, making it easier to cast into those ornate shapes. It also gave the pewter a satisfying heft and a brighter sheen, especially when polished. In essence, it made your fancy plates fancier. The problem, as you're about to discover in the most insidious way possible, is that lead is also incredibly reactive. And the tomato, that vibrant, innocent-looking fruit you're so bravely ingesting, it's a little acid bomb, patiently waiting to unleash its chemical mischief. Think back to your rudimentary chemistry lessons, or perhaps that time you accidentally mixed baking soda and vinegar and created a mini volcano in your kitchen sink. Acids, by their very nature, are solvents. They seek to dissolve, to break down, to react. The tomato, bursting with natural acids, primarily citric acid, but also malic acid and others, is perfectly equipped for this task. As that warm, tangy tomato sauce sits on your pewter plate, perhaps for an hour as you slowly dine and converse, or even longer if it's left to cool and then reheated, those organic acids get to work. They begin to literally leach lead from the surface of your beautiful dish. It's a microscopic process, invisible to the naked eye. You don't see your plate dissolving like some B-movie acid scene. Instead, tiny lead ions, freed from their metallic bonds by the relentless acidic assault, are released directly into your food. Each spoonful, each forkful, becomes a delivery system for a minute dose of poison. And because you're a person of means, you likely eat tomatoes more often, and perhaps in larger quantities than those who still view them with suspicion. Your very affluence, your access to this exotic fruit and your fancy tableware, turns out to be your greatest vulnerability. It's the ultimate ironic twist. The very things that define your high status are quietly undermining your health. It's almost like discovering your super expensive, artisanal kale smoothie is actually laced with trace amounts of, say, arsenic. You'd be furious, right? This silent, ongoing ingestion of lead is cumulative. It doesn't cause immediate, dramatic collapse, which is precisely why the connection was so difficult to make. People weren't dropping dead at the dinner table with a half-eaten tomato slice in their mouths. Instead, the symptoms were subtle, slow onset, and often mimicked other common ailments of the era. You might experience what the doctors of the time called colic, severe abdominal pain, a crushing nausea that made every meal a struggle. You might feel a profound, inexplicable fatigue, a lethargy that clung to you like a damp cloak, making it difficult to engage in your aristocratic duties, let alone enjoy them. Headaches, often described as throbbing or constricting, could become a constant companion. Then there were the neurological effects, far more disturbing and often misinterpreted as moral failings or signs of madness. Lead poisoning can attack the nervous system, leading to irritability, mood swings, and even cognitive decline. Imagine a brilliant nobleman, once sharp and witty, slowly becoming forgetful, confused, or prone to irrational outbursts. His family might attribute it to age, stress, or even some divine displeasure, never suspecting the innocent, vibrant red fruit on his dinner plate. Historians still argue whether the perceived madness of certain historical figures, known for their love of rich foods and fine dining, might have been exacerbated or even caused by chronic lead poisoning from their tableware. It's a fascinating, if grim, line of inquiry. A quirky tidbit that reinforces this silent menace. Doctors of the era, puzzled by these persistent, debilitating symptoms that seem to disproportionately affect the wealthy, sometimes ascribed them to bad humors or miasmas, or even too much study and not enough fresh air. They just couldn't connect the dots between the beautiful pewter and the mysterious malaise. It's almost like they preferred to blame planetary alignment rather than the actual plate. One infamous example, though not directly related to tomatoes, involved the Devonshire colic. which plagued the region for centuries. It was eventually linked not to a particular food, but to lead-lined cider presses. The acidity of the cider leached the lead, mirroring precisely the mechanism at play with the tomatoes and pewter. It's a testament to how pervasive lead was in daily life, and how effectively acids could mobilize it. The real tragedy is that the very act of cooking and serving tomatoes often amplified the problem. If you were preparing a rich tomato sauce, simmering it for hours in a pewter pot, the heat would increase the rate of chemical reaction, accelerating the leaching process. The longer the contact, the more lead dissolved. Then, serving that same sauce on a pewter plate only continued the chemical extraction. It was a double whammy, a culinary trap that, for centuries, nobody understood. You'd think they'd eventually connect the dots, but sometimes an expensive belief is harder to let go of than a pesky illness. So, as you recline after your magnificent meal, perhaps enjoying a glass of wine, you might feel a vague discomfort in your stomach, a slight dull ache in your head. You might attribute it to overindulgence or perhaps the changing weather. But beneath the surface, a silent war is being waged, molecule by molecule. Your brave embrace of the wolf peach has initiated a slow, unseen process of self-poisoning. The tomato, innocent and delicious, had simply revealed the dangerous secret hidden within your cherished, prestigious plates. It wasn't the plant that was poisonous. It was the very symbol of your refined existence. And that, my friend, is a bitter pill to swallow, even if it comes wrapped in the sweet, tangy embrace of a sun-ripened tomato. The fear of the wolf peach, initially rooted in botanical kinship, had found an accidental, ironic justification, not in the fruit itself, but in the tools of its consumption. The world tilts, not a gentle sway, but a sudden, violent lurch that sends your stomach churning upwards into your throat. A wave of nausea, cold and clammy, washes over you, leaving a metallic tang on your tongue. You clench your jaw, hoping to keep down the meager morning meal, but it's a futile effort. A sharp, piercing pain digs into your abdomen, a knot twisting tighter and tighter, making you double over. It's a relentless, grinding agony, a colic so severe you'd swear someone was wringing out your insides like a wet cloth. Your head throbs, a dull, persistent ache that vibrates behind your eyes, making the light unbearable. Even the rustle of silk draperies feels like a roar. Every muscle aches, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that steals your strength, making even lifting a hand feel like hoisting a boulder. Your limbs feel heavy, useless, like sacks of sand. You try to rise, but your knees buckle, and you slump back onto the plush velvet cushions, feeling weaker than you've ever felt in your life. Your skin, once rosy with health, now has a pallor, an almost translucent quality, as if the very life is draining from you. This isn't just a passing malady. This is something insidious, something that clings to you, refusing to release its grip. And if you were living in an aristocratic European household in, say, the mid-18th century, and these symptoms became your unwelcome companions, you'd probably begin to suspect that you won't survive this. No, this wasn't just a bad oyster. As you lie there, consumed by this escalating misery, your mind, surprisingly, remains sharp enough to connect the dots, albeit incorrectly. You recall the exotic, vibrant fruit that graced your plate just yesterday, the curious wolf peach that you, a daring trendsetter among your peers, had sampled. You remember its bright, almost unnaturally red hue, its soft, yielding flesh, and a shiver runs through you despite the feverish heat building in your core. It must be that. It has to be. This new, foreign edible, so unlike the familiar fare of roasted meats and stewed root vegetables, surely holds the secret to your sudden, horrifying decline. This was the logical conclusion, after all. You ate the tomato, you got sick. A simple cause and effect, right? But as we now know, with the benefit of centuries of scientific advancement and the relentless march of medical understanding, the true villain wasn't the innocent tomato. Oh no, the tomato was merely the unwitting accomplice, the acidic catalyst in a silent drama of slow poisoning. The true culprit, that insidious, pervasive metal, was lead. Remember those exquisite pewter plates you dined from, the ones you inherited from your esteemed ancestors, shining with a dull, respectable sheen? And recall how the tomato's natural acidity, like a diligent but malevolent housekeeper, was quietly leaching lead from those very surfaces, turning your gourmet meal into a meticulously crafted dose of toxin. Well, the symptoms you're now experiencing are the agonizing, unmistakable hallmarks of lead poisoning. A malady known, albeit imperfectly, even in ancient times, though its full scope and insidious nature were rarely grasped. One of the most common and truly agonizing symptoms was that gut-wrenching abdominal pain, often referred to as lead colic. Imagine the worst stomachache you've ever had, then multiply it by 10 and subtract any hope of quick relief. This pain could be so severe that it mimicked acute appendicitis or other life-threatening abdominal emergencies, sometimes even leading to unnecessary surgeries. People would writhe in agony, convinced that their internal organs were somehow being consumed or corrupted by the very food they had ingested. Beyond the gut, the nervous system bore a heavy brunt. You might experience profound fatigue, an overwhelming exhaustion that no amount of sleep could alleviate. Headaches, too, were a constant companion, often described as a dull, oppressive pressure or a sharp, drilling pain. And then there was the neurological impact. Lead, a neurotoxin, slowly but surely began to erode cognitive function. You might find your memory faltering, your thoughts becoming muddled, a persistent brain fog settling over your once sharp intellect. Irritability, mood swings, and even full-blown delirium were not uncommon in severe cases. Imagine being a respected noble, accustomed to witty banter and incisive political discourse, only to find yourself struggling to form coherent sentences, your temper flaring at the slightest provocation. It must have been utterly terrifying, adding mental anguish to the physical torment. In some of the most severe cases, lead poisoning could lead to convulsions, coma, and eventually, death. It was a slow, degrading descent into madness and physical decay, and it was often mistakenly labeled as a fever, a wasting sickness, or even a form of melancholia. One particularly grim, albeit less common, symptom that later medical science would identify was the Burton's line, a thin, blue-black line that could appear along the gums, caused by lead sulfide deposits. While perhaps not widely recognized by the general public, certainly not understood as a lead symptom, it was one of those subtle, peculiar bodily changes that could add to the general sense of unease. You might notice your gums looking a bit off, a strange discoloration, and just attribute it to poor dental hygiene or some other vague ailment, further deepening the mystery of your suffering. Mainstream historical fact. It wasn't until the 19th century that medical understanding of lead poisoning significantly advanced, moving beyond anecdotal observations to more systematic study. Quirkier tidbit. Even as late as the 18th century, some medical texts still suggested bizarre cures for various maladies that we now recognize as lead poisoning, including bleeding, purging, or even applying poultices made of pigeon dung. which, as you can imagine, did precisely nothing to alleviate the lead's toxic effects, and probably made you smell faintly of, well, pigeon. Historians still argue whether the widespread fear of tomatoes among the aristocracy was genuinely due to a significant number of lead poisoning cases, or if it was amplified by a general suspicion of new, exotic foods, making any illness that followed consumption a convenient scapegoat, regardless of the precise ratio of genuine illness to exaggerated fear. The connection between the tomato and these debilitating symptoms became firmly entrenched in the European imagination. For the wealthy, who could afford both the novel fruit and the lead-laced tableware, the tomato became synonymous with illness, a beautiful but deadly tempter. It was a reputation cemented by suffering, by the very real and agonizing symptoms that afflicted those who dared to embrace the wolf peach. The narrative was clear. The tomato was dangerous. It caused agonizing pain, weakness, and madness. And for centuries, this became its chilling legacy. You are hovering over a bustling marketplace, the air thick with the earthy scent of damp soil and fresh produce, a cacophony of vendors hawking their wares. Sunlight streams through gaps in the awnings, illuminating piles of glistening green cabbages and earthy potatoes, but your gaze drifts to a humble stall where a family huddles around a rough-hewn wooden table. Their plates, if you can even call them that, are simple, unadorned bowls of coarse, reddish-brown clay, or perhaps just hollowed-out sections of old tree trunks, smoothed by countless meals. They're about to eat, and here's a little reality check for you. If you were transported back to this precise moment, given a choice of dining with this family or at a baron's lavish feast, and told to pick one scenario where you probably won't survive the meal, well, let's just say your odds are much better here. Because while those grand aristocrats, with their delicate sensibilities and even more delicate health, were busy blaming the innocent wolf peach for their debilitating ailments, an entirely different narrative was unfolding in the kitchens and dining nooks of the common folk. You see them now, breaking bread, sharing a stew, perhaps even an early, brave soul tentatively biting into a vibrant red fruit. A love apple, as some daringly called it, brought back from distant lands. Their survival wasn't due to superior fortitude or a secret alchemical antidote. It was, quite simply, a matter of material. Imagine, if you will, the daily tableau. You, as a commoner, might rise with the sun, your hands calloused from honest labor, your palate accustomed to robust, simple fare. Your kitchen, often little more than a hearth and a few shelves, boasts no gleaming pewter. Instead, you reach for a sturdy wooden trencher, perhaps carved decades ago, its surface smoothed by generations of elbows and the endless scrape of spoons. Or maybe you pull down a piece of earthenware, fired in a local kiln, its glaze, if it has any made from common, non-toxic materials, a world away from the lead-laced artistry adorning the tables of the elite. This isn't a choice born of wisdom, mind you, but of necessity. These materials were cheap, readily available, and utterly devoid of the insidious lead that quietly lurked in the shimmering sheen of aristocratic tableware. So when the occasional daring commoner, perhaps influenced by the buzz of exotic new plants, decided to experiment with this curious new fruit, the tomato, their experience was entirely different from their blue-blooded counterparts. The tomato, with its bright acidity, still burst on the tongue, a tart counterpoint to a savory stew, but that was it. There was no slow, creeping malaise, no sudden, inexplicable bouts of colic, no withered limbs or the telltale lead line on their gums that would later become a grim diagnostic sign for physicians. Their humble wooden bowls and unglazed ceramic pots simply didn't react with the tomato's natural acids. The fruit, for them, remained just that, a fruit. A potentially interesting, if somewhat unusual, addition to their diet, but certainly not a harbinger of doom. It never occurred to them, for instance, that their dinnerware was saving their lives, which, let's be honest, is a pretty good return on investment for a piece of wood. This quiet, unnoticed dichotomy created a fascinating paradox. While the powerful and educated, armed with their scientific theories and their fancy, poisonous plates, concluded the tomato was deadly, the unlettered and the unassuming, with their practical, humble utensils, were slowly, empirically proving it harmless. Historians still argue whether this grassroots, unrecorded adoption of the tomato by the common folk was a significant factor in eventually dismantling its deadly reputation, or if it was simply a slow, inevitable tide of culinary experimentation. But what is undeniable is that their simple dining habits provided an unwitting shield. Think back to the aristocratic afflictions we discussed earlier, the mysterious illnesses that plagued the wealthy when they dared to consume the love apple. Remember how the tomato's acidity acted like a tiny culinary acid trip, leaching lead from those pristine pewter plates. Well, for the commoner, there was no lead to leach. Their wooden trenchers, though perhaps prone to splintering or harboring a rogue crumb from last week's bread, were chemically inert to the tomato's innocent tang. Their earthenware pots, though perhaps prone to breaking if dropped, much like your phone if you're not careful, but arguably less expensive to replace, contained no hidden toxins. It was a fortuitous alignment of poverty and practicality, where the very lack of luxury became a life-saving grace. This stark contrast highlights a profound, albeit often overlooked, aspect of historical health. Sometimes the path of least resistance, the most economically viable option, turns out to be the healthiest. It's a bit like how modern health trends often circle back to simple, whole foods after decades of processed, advanced options. Back then, the advanced option of shiny pewter was a death trap, while the primitive wood or clay was the true path to wellness. You can almost hear the commoners chuckling, unaware, over their safe, tomato-laden meals, while the aristocrats in their grand halls writhed in agony, blaming the fruit. A quirky tidbit of history, indeed. Sometimes, being poor meant you simply couldn't afford to poison yourself. This quiet revolution, devoid of grand declarations or scientific papers, played out in thousands of humble homes across Europe. As more commoners encountered the tomato, as it trickled down from botanical gardens to small garden plots, their positive experiences began to chip away at the formidable wall of fear erected by aristocratic illness and scientific misinterpretation. It wasn't a sudden paradigm shift, but a slow, almost imperceptible normalization. The tomato became, for many, just another edible, albeit one with a curious backstory. It entered stews, sauces, and salads without fanfare. Its vibrant color a simple addition. Its taste a pleasant discovery, utterly unconnected to the convulsions and decay that plagued those who dined differently. This unheralded success among the commoners, a testament to their accidental wisdom, was truly their fortunate fate. They ate, they lived, and unknowingly they paved the way for the humble tomato to shed its infamous reputation and eventually grace tables across the globe, becoming one of the world's most beloved ingredients. And all because they just didn't have the fancy, lethal dinnerware. You find yourself in a dusty European marketplace, the scent of fresh bread mingling with the earthy aroma of root vegetables, and the faint, unsettling whiff of something vaguely putrid from the fishmonger's stall. The clamor of hawkers and the gentle bleating of sheep is background noise to the true currency of the street. Whispers. They slither from stall to stall, carried on the breath of gossiping women, passed between merchants haggling over prices, and echoing from the smoky corners of taverns where men nurse their ales. And what are these whispers about, you ask? Oh, they're about the devil's apple, the wolf peach, the poison fruit that has, they say, brought the powerful to their knees. This, my friend, is how fear travels. It's a network far older and more insidious than any modern telegraph or internet. Powered by human curiosity, suspicion, and a rather potent cocktail of anecdotal evidence mixed with good old-fashioned terror. Remember those grand tables, laden with lead pewter, where the acidic tomato silently leached its deadly secret? Well, the news of those aristocratic afflictions didn't stay confined to the gilded drawing rooms of the elite. No, it seeped out, often distorted, always amplified, until it became the stuff of terrifying cautionary tales whispered from mother to child. Don't touch the shiny red berry, dearie, you might hear a grandmother admonish, her voice low and grave. It will twist your insides and make your hair fall out just like it did poor Lord Fitzwilliam. The specifics were lost, the lead connection entirely ignored, but the core message remained. This foreign fruit was a harbinger of doom. It's easy to imagine yourself there, standing in the crowd, absorbing these snippets. You see the skepticism on faces, then the dawning horror. A simple, vibrant fruit transformed into a symbol of danger. This narrative wasn't just a fleeting fad. It rooted itself deep within the cultural soil of various European societies, particularly in the northern reaches, where the tomato struggled to gain acceptance beyond an ornamental curiosity, while the sun-drenched regions of Italy and parts of Spain, perhaps due to different culinary traditions or simply less pervasive use of leaded tableware, began to cautiously embrace the tomato elsewhere. The myth held fast like a stubborn stain. Consider France, where the tomato was often called the pomme d'amour, or love apple, yet was largely considered a decorative plant, often grown in gardens but rarely consumed. The fear wasn't about its aphrodisiac qualities, mind you, but its perceived toxicity. Imagine a plant so beautiful, so enticingly red, yet believed to be a deadly trap. It's almost a Gothic romance in itself, isn't it? Meanwhile, in Germanic lands, the term wolf peach stuck around, hearkening back to its nightshade lineage and the ancient fears of plants associated with witchcraft and poison. It was a name that evoked the wild, untamed, and dangerous aspects of nature, a clear sign that this wasn't something you'd want on your supper plate. The propagation of this myth wasn't always through dramatic public pronouncements. Often it was far more subtle, woven into the very fabric of daily life. Perhaps a local herbalist, seeing its resemblance to belladonna, would issue a dire warning. Or a superstitious cook might simply refuse to handle it, spreading their trepidation to their patrons. There's a quirky tidbit here. Some early medical texts, rather than dispelling the myth, actually reinforced it by categorizing the tomato with other known poisonous plants, or by offering convoluted, scientific explanations for its supposed ill effects, often involving notions of cold humors or bilious dispositions that would be aggravated by the fruit. It was a self-perpetuating cycle. People got sick from lead, blamed the tomato, and then experts confirmed their fears with pseudoscience. You see how easily a partial truth, or rather a completely misinterpreted truth, can snowball into a widespread superstition. It's a stark reminder, isn't it? of how easily a plausible-sounding falsehood can take root and spread, even when the truth is staring you right in the face. You probably won't survive this if you rely solely on village gossip for your dietary advice. This phenomenon wasn't unique to the tomato, of course. History is littered with examples of foods feared for erroneous reasons, from potatoes being linked to leprosy in some parts of Europe, to cucumbers being thought to cause fevers. But the tomato's story stands out due to the sheer longevity and intensity of the fear. The commoners remember them. The ones eating off wooden trenchers and ceramic bowls, blissfully unaware of the lead-lined danger lurking for their wealthier counterparts. Their good health, ironically, did little to dispel the myth among the upper echelons or those who admired their refined tableware. Instead, it might have reinforced another, equally baseless belief, that the robust constitution of the peasant somehow rendered them immune to what would fell a delicate aristocrat. After all, if the poor could eat it and live, it must be some special constitution, right? Not just different dishes. It's a bit like assuming a medieval knight could survive a dragon attack because his armor was particularly shiny, rather than because the dragon was actually a really well-trained dog with a bad cough. The mainstream historical fact here is undeniable. For centuries, across much of Europe, the tomato was viewed with deep suspicion, considered not just unpalatable but actively dangerous. This belief wasn't just confined to a few isolated pockets, but permeated common thought and even scholarly discourse for a significant period. Historians still argue whether it was culinary innovation, gradual exposure, or the slow adoption of safer dining practices that finally began to chip away at this deeply ingrained fear. Was it the spread of Neapolitan pizza, daring chefs in France, or simply the eventual demise of lead-laden pewter that truly turned the tide? The answer, like so many things in history, is likely a complex tapestry woven from all these threads. The rumors persisted, fueled by repetition and the simple human tendency to err on the side of caution when faced with something unfamiliar and potentially deadly. It became a piece of common wisdom, passed down through generations, often without anyone questioning its origin or its factual basis. The poison myth of the tomato wasn't just a scientific misunderstanding. It was a cultural phenomenon, a testament to the power of suggestion and the viral nature of fear in a world with limited true scientific understanding. The poor tomato, so innocent in itself, bore the brunt of a tragic case of mistaken identity, its vibrant red hue serving only to heighten suspicion, rather than inspire appetite. You're standing there in the quiet hush of a Renaissance kitchen, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs clinging to the air like an old story. You watch as the cook, with a nervous glance over their shoulder, gingerly approaches a basket of gleaming, crimson fruit. You remember the whispers, the hushed tales carried on the wind from one village square to the next, stories of mysterious ailments, of the wealthy falling ill after partaking of this exotic newcomer. Your stomach tightens a little, a prickle of unease crawling up your spine. Because, let's be honest, if you were about to bite into something with this reputation, knowing what you now know, you probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics, let alone the actual fruit. Your mind would simply short-circuit with all the conflicting data. And that reputation, it wasn't just built on rumor and the unfortunate reality of lead-laced pewter, though those certainly did their part, didn't they? No, it was also etched into the very fabric of its identity, a label designed, it seemed, to cement its dangerous aura. When the meticulous categorizers of the natural world, those earnest botanists, finally got around to giving this vibrant curiosity a proper scientific moniker. They didn't exactly choose something reassuring like happy berry or sunshine orb. Oh no. They christened it Lycopersicum esculentum. Now let's break that down because it's a mouthful and a half, isn't it? The esculentum part is simple enough. It means edible. Harmless, right? A reassuring whisper in a sea of suspicion. A tiny beacon of hope. But it's the Lycopersicum that truly sends shivers down the spine, especially when you consider the historical context. Lycopersicum comes from the ancient Greek lykos, meaning wolf, and persicon, meaning peach. So essentially, you're holding an edible wolf peach. Think about that for a second. A wolf. Not exactly the cuddliest of creatures in medieval folklore, was it? Wolves were primal symbols of hunger, danger, the wild, the untamed. They lurked in the shadows, preying on the innocent, often associated with shapeshifters, cunning, and dark magic. They embodied a primal, ancestral fear. And then a peach. A soft, sweet, innocent fruit, a symbol of bounty and temptation. The juxtaposition is jarring, isn't it? It's like naming a fluffy kitten Seathulhu's tiny terror. You just know something's off. This wasn't some gentle misnomer. It was a potent, almost poetic, summary of the public's deep-seated dread. It suggested something deceptive, something that looked appealing but harbored a predatory, wild essence. The very name seemed to confirm every suspicion, every whispered tale of its nefarious nature. It wasn't just a fruit. It was a botanical warning label, a whispered curse in Latin. You can almost imagine the botanist, quill in hand, sighing dramatically. Well, given its track record of making dukes ill and its general aura of impending doom, Wolf Peach seems entirely appropriate. Besides, Poison Apple was already taken by that other story, wasn't it? This nomenclature solidified the tomato's place not just as a potential poison, but as something with more sinister, almost supernatural connotations. In many cultures, plants with unusual appearances or perceived toxicity were often linked to witchcraft and sorcery. Belladonna, mandrake, henbane, these were the infamous ingredients in witches' brews, used for everything from potions to poisons. And now, by its very name, the tomato was entering their shadowy company. It was no longer just making people sick. It was dabbling in dark arts, a botanical accomplice to the arcane. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some historical texts even suggest that the wolf in Wolf Peach wasn't solely about the animal, but about a specific type of plant blight, a wolf disease that would infect crops and make them appear sickly and dangerous, thereby linking the tomato to agricultural misfortune and ruin. This dual interpretation only amplified its ominous aura, painting it as both a direct threat and a harbinger of broader ill fortune for the land. This pervasive fear, deeply ingrained and further fueled by its scientific appellation, wasn't just abstract. It had real-world consequences. People avoided planting tomatoes near their homes, fearing they would attract misfortune or evil spirits. They were relegated to the furthest corners of gardens, grown perhaps out of pure botanical curiosity, but certainly not for consumption by anyone with a shred of self-preservation. This widespread avoidance, of course, inadvertently kept many commoners safe from the lead poisoning that plagued the aristocracy, reinforcing their belief that the wealthy were simply foolish for daring to touch such accursed fruit. Remember how the common folk, with their simple wooden bowls and ceramic dishes, unknowingly dodged that very real bullet. This name, in a twisted, ironic way, justified their caution and fear. One mainstream historical fact to consider is that Carl Linnaeus, often hailed as the father of modern taxonomy, initially classified the tomato within the Solanum genus, placing it alongside potatoes and eggplants. However, it was later separated into its own genus, Lycopersicon, by Philip Miller in the 1700s, further cementing its distinct and distinctively feared identity in the scientific community. Historians still argue whether Miller's specific choice of Lycopersicon was a direct reflection of common European folklore at the time, specifically the widespread fear of the plant, or if it was based purely on botanical characteristics that were later misinterpreted and amplified through the lens of existing superstitions. The idea of a wolf peach became a vivid mental image, a whispered caution passed down through generations, almost a bedtime story in itself. Imagine trying to convince someone whose grandmother told them tales of hexes and curses associated with this very name, that this wolf peach was perfectly safe to eat. You'd have better luck convincing a cat to enjoy a bath. The name itself became a self-fulfilling prophecy of fear, cementing the belief that the tomato was inherently dangerous, a trickster plant designed to ensnare the unsuspecting. This wasn't just about an unfortunate moniker. It was about the profound power of language to shape perception, to imbue an object with a narrative of dread that transcended simple botanical classification. Every time the word Lycopersicon was uttered, it wasn't just a scientific classification. It was a retelling of the wolf's cunning, the peach's deceptive allure, and the very real illnesses that had befallen those who dared to defy its ominous warning. It solidified the tomato's position in the minds of many as not merely indigestible, but truly venomous, perhaps even cursed. The mere sound of wolf peach conjured images of dark forests and forgotten rites, a far cry from the vibrant, wholesome fruit we know today. It's almost comical, isn't it, how a couple of Greek words could create such a widespread panic, transforming a simple fruit into a botanical boogeyman. You can practically hear the dramatic music swelling in the background, can't you? This wasn't just a plant. It was a prop in a gothic horror story, starring you, the brave or foolish consumer. You step now into a different kind of chamber, one where the air hangs heavy with the quiet hum of observation, not the frantic whispers of fear. You are in a European botanical garden, a sanctified space dedicated to the systematic study of flora, a place of hushed reverence for the natural world. Here, the wolf peach, that fearsome Lycopersicon esculentum you learned about, is no longer a monster of folklore, but an enigma meticulously catalogued and confined, stripped of its wild, untamed aura. Imagine the scene. Rows upon rows of carefully cultivated beds, each plant labeled with its precise Latin designation, its geographical origins, its supposed medicinal or toxic properties. Sunlight filters through the dense canopy of ancient trees, casting dappled shadows on the gravel paths where scholars, dressed in their sober academic robes, move with a ponderous gravitas. They pore over specimens with magnifying glasses clutched in hand, their brows furrowed in intense concentration, not on how to prepare a delicious sauce, mind you, but on the number of stamens, the precise shape of a leaf, the subtle pigmentation of a fruit. Their interest is purely in the taxonomy, the classification, the pure, unadulterated science of botany. They are charting its growth cycles, noting its morphological similarities to its truly poisonous cousins, the deadly belladonna that brings on hallucinatory delirium, the henbane that steals your reason. They are verifying its classification, reinforcing its lineage of potential peril, noting its uncanny resemblance to its truly poisonous cousins. They know it's a nightshade, and that, for them, is enough to warrant extreme caution, a cautious distance that would last for centuries. This is an era, remember, when botanical gardens like those in Padua, established in 1545, or Pisa, just a few years later, were becoming vital hubs of scientific discovery. They weren't just pretty places for a Sunday stroll. They were living laboratories, repositories of global flora, where plants were dissected, categorized, and their properties theoretically understood. It's where the formal study of botany truly took root, branching out from mere herbalism into something akin to modern science. Yet, even within these hallowed halls of nascent scientific inquiry, the tomato's true nature remained, largely, a mystery wrapped in an academic riddle. You see the meticulous drawings, the delicate watercolor renditions of the plant in various stages of its life cycle, preserved in leather-bound volumes. Every visible detail is captured with an almost religious devotion. Every tiny hair on the stem, every subtle shift in leaf venation. Except, of course, the most crucial one. No one is sketching the interaction of its vibrant red juice with the leaded pewter plates of the aristocracy. No one is considering the silent, insidious alchemy that turned a healthy fruit into a harbinger of debilitating illness. Their studies are exhaustive in their botanical precision, their records impeccable, but entirely blind to the cultural and culinary context that had turned the tomato into a pariah. They're like someone studying a car's engine without ever considering it needs fuel. Or, more accurately, without realizing that putting the wrong fuel in leads to catastrophic failure due to an unseen chemical reaction. Honestly, if you were one of those early, curious botanists, sniffing and poking at this wolf peach with such intense, focused detachment, you'd probably not survive the week if you decided to push the boundaries of academic inquiry into taste testing with the wrong utensils. There's a hushed corner of the garden, near a bubbling stone fountain, where you overhear whispers about the plant's more esoteric reputation. You might even catch a hushed conversation among the scholars, speculating on its more amorous properties. Some whispered that the tomato, despite its perceived dangers, held powers of persuasion, capable of stirring passions. It's said that certain daring individuals, perhaps more lovesick than logical, would brew potions with its leaves, hoping for a romantic enchantment, completely ignoring the fact they were basically concocting a mild poison. Imagine trying to woo someone with a plant known to cause stomach upset and mysterious wasting diseases. Smooth move, Romeo. It's almost enough to make you chuckle, despite the solemnity of the setting. You can almost hear the botanical garden tour guide, if such a thing existed back then, pointing to the tomato plant with a flourish and saying, "And here, ladies and gentlemen, we have the infamous lycopersicum. Please, no touching. We've had incidents, and frankly, the laundry bill for those unfortunate robes is simply astronomical." This academic distance, this cautious approach, ironically preserved the myth of the tomato's inherent toxicity, because the botanical gardens treated it as a fascinating, but potentially dangerous, curiosity, a specimen to be studied, not consumed. The wider public's fears were never truly challenged. The careful, almost reverent way these scholars handled the plant, the hushed tones when speaking of its family, only reinforced the notion that it harbored a sinister secret, a hidden malevolence. It wasn't the plant itself that was inherently deadly. It was the unfortunate confluence of aristocratic wealth, questionable tableware, and a profound, collective lack of understanding about Leeds' insidious nature. The puzzle pieces were all there, scattered, but no one saw the full picture. And thus, its true nature as a wholesome, edible fruit remained largely obscured from the broader European population for far too long. Historians still argue whether the initial reluctance to embrace the tomato as food was primarily due to its nightshade kinship, or if the aristocratic poisonings, even when misunderstood, played a far more significant role in cementing its pariah status in the wider European consciousness. Was it the botanical classification that sealed its fate, or the repeated, albeit accidental, self-poisonings of the elite? In these early gardens, the question remained unanswered, the true culprit hidden in plain sight, not in the vibrant fruit, but in the dull gleam of a pewter plate. The scholars recorded every observable fact about the plant, but the crucial missing piece of the puzzle lay outside the garden walls, in the dining rooms of the wealthy, and thus, its true nature as a wholesome, edible fruit remained largely obscured. You stand in a sun-drenched courtyard, the air thick with the scent of thyme and distant sea salt. Stone walls, bleached by centuries of sun, hold the heat of the day, even as the afternoon stretches long. A gentle breeze whispers through the olive trees, rustling their silver-green leaves, and somewhere the faint clatter of a distant kitchen signals the approach of an evening meal. This isn't the grand, formal gardens of northern Europe you've just left, where the wolf peach was a mere botanical curiosity, fenced off for cautious study. No, this is different. You feel it in the air, a subtle shift in attitude, a grudging curiosity perhaps, a slow, almost imperceptible softening towards the once feared fruit. Here, in the southern reaches of Europe, Italy specifically, and then across the shimmering Mediterranean to Spain, the tomato's story takes a different, albeit agonizingly slow, turn. While the aristocrats up north were still dropping like flies after a fancy dinner, unknowingly poisoned by their lead-laced pewter and blaming the innocent tomato, a quiet rebellion was brewing. Or more accurately, a quiet hunger was rummaging through pantries. You see, the common folk didn't have the luxury of expensive, lead-heavy tableware. They ate off humble wooden trenchers, simple ceramic bowls, or sometimes just a piece of stale bread as a plate. Remember that fortuitous fate of the commoners. Their poverty, ironically, was their salvation. And it was their hands, calloused by labor, that would eventually, cautiously, pick up the despised wolf peach and dare to taste. Honestly, if you were living back then, relying on the opinions of the rich and their fancy plates, you probably wouldn't survive your first garden experiment. Good thing you're just listening to this. It begins, as many good culinary tales do, with necessity and a hint of desperation. In the warmer climes of southern Italy, particularly around Naples and further south, the tomato, despite its ominous reputation, found a niche. The climate here was simply perfect for it: long, hot summers, fertile volcanic soil. It thrived, growing almost like a weed in abandoned fields and alongside fences. For peasants struggling to put food on the table, a prolific, easily grown plant, even one rumored to be poisonous, eventually became too tempting to ignore. They weren't reading weighty botanical texts. They were just trying to feed their families. And so, a few brave, or perhaps just very hungry, souls started experimenting. Initially, the tomato wasn't celebrated or even widely accepted. It was viewed with suspicion, given to the poor, or perhaps used as animal fodder. Think of it as the ultimate culinary underdog. You know, like when your crazy uncle tries to convince everyone that pickled juice is a health tonic. Most people roll their eyes, but then, Inevitably, one person actually tries it. That was the tomato in southern Italy. The earliest documented culinary uses tend to be quite basic. Simmered sauces, often with a good deal of garlic and olive oil, used to stretch meager meals or brighten plain pasta or bread. It was about flavor, yes, but also about volume and affordability. Historians still argue whether it was sheer desperation or a pioneering culinary spirit that first truly introduced the tomato into the southern Italian diet. One mainstream historical fact, though, is that the earliest published recipes featuring tomatoes begin to appear in Italian cookbooks in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a full 200 years after its arrival in Europe. These weren't fancy, aristocratic dishes. Oh no. They were humble, robust preparations for the common table. For instance, a cookbook from Naples in 1692 features a recipe for tomato sauce in the Spanish style, suggesting influence from across the sea, or at least a shared culinary lineage. This sauce, often served with meat or fish, marked a genuine, if tentative, step towards culinary integration. Across the Tyrrhenian Sea in Spain, the acceptance followed a slightly different, though equally gradual path. Spain had a more direct and sustained connection to the Americas due to its colonial empire. The tomato arrived there perhaps even earlier than in Italy, but initially suffered the same fate: garden ornament, botanical curiosity. However, in regions like Andalusia, with its rich Moorish culinary heritage and a climate perfectly suited to the plant, the tomato also began its slow insinuation into the diet. It might have been initially used more as a flavoring agent or a garnish, subtly added to dishes rather than taking center stage. The Spanish had already mastered cold soups like gazpacho, and the tomato, with its refreshing acidity, eventually found a natural home there, albeit after a long period of distrust. A quirky tidbit that demonstrates this gradual shift. Some historical accounts suggest that initially, tomatoes in Spain were actually consumed more by soldiers and sailors, who, far from the rigid culinary norms of aristocratic courts, were perhaps more open to experimenting with new, readily available foods during long voyages or campaigns. Imagine a hardened conquistador, far from home, staring at a strange red fruit thinking, well, it probably won't kill me faster than a hostile indigenous tribe. It's a testament to desperation, really. The key to Southern Europe's slow embrace lay in a convergence of factors. A favorable climate that allowed the tomato to flourish, a peasant class reliant on easily grown crops and unburdened by leaded tableware, and perhaps a slightly less dogmatic approach to new edibles compared to the more academically rigid North. The wolf peach moniker, though still whispered in some circles, began to lose its potency when confronted with the reality of a plentiful harvest, and the tangy burst of flavor that, when not served on poison plates, did not, in fact, cause convulsions or death. The very qualities that made it problematic for the wealthy. Its acidity made it a vibrant, exciting addition to dishes for those who could appreciate its true character. The fear, though deeply ingrained by centuries of nightshade lore and decades of mistaken identity, was finally, painstakingly, starting to erode under the relentless sun of the South. You're now drifting through the bustling, sun-drenched streets of Naples, a city where the air itself hums with a vibrant, almost chaotic energy. The salty breeze from the Tyrrhenian Sea carries the scent of baking bread, fermenting grapes, and something else, something sweet and tangy, a smell that's slowly but surely weaving its way into the very fabric of the city. You might not notice it at first, amidst the clang of street vendors, the chatter of merchants, and the distant, mournful cries of fishermen. But it's there, an olfactory signature of change. This isn't the hushed, polite acceptance you saw in the aristocratic gardens of Northern Europe. This is a full-throated, messy, delicious embrace. If you've been following along, you know that for centuries, the tomato was basically persona non grata, the botanical equivalent of that one relative everyone avoids at holiday dinners. But here in Naples, something extraordinary is brewing, something that will utterly transform its reputation, taking it from feared wolf peach to global culinary icon. And honestly, considering what you've learned about its past, you probably won't survive this journey unscathed if you're holding a lead plate. Imagine, for a moment, the Neapolitan commoner. Life is hard. Work is scarce. Food is a constant concern. They aren't dining on elaborate, multi-course meals served on gleaming pewter. Their kitchens, if you can even call them that, are humble, often just a shared fire or a small, soot-stained hearth. Their tableware? Simple, unadorned ceramic, earthenware, or even just a piece of flatbread serving as a makeshift plate. This, ironically, is their salvation. Remember how the rich folks, with their fancy lead-infused dishes, were inadvertently poisoning themselves. Well, the working-class Neapolitans, through sheer economic necessity, were bypassing that deadly interaction entirely. Their acidic tomatoes, spread on humble dough, met no corrosive metal. They were, in essence, conducting an unintentional, delicious, and life-saving experiment right there in their cramped, vibrant alleyways. The stage, then, is set not in a grand palace or a scientific laboratory, but in the gritty, pulsating heart of a port city. Naples was, and still is, a city of contrasts. Breathtaking beauty alongside stark poverty, ancient traditions clashing with desperate innovation. The Neapolitans were resourceful, turning whatever humble ingredients they had into something satisfying. Flour, water, yeast, olive oil, these were staples, the very bedrock of their diet. And when a mysterious, vibrantly red fruit, relatively easy to grow in their fertile volcanic soil, started making its way from the fields to the markets, it was approached not with the intellectual skepticism of botanists, nor the fearful caution of aristocrats, but with the pragmatic curiosity of the hungry. This wasn't a top-down culinary revolution, no royal decree demanding tomato consumption. This was a groundswell, an organic evolution born of necessity and ingenuity. The earliest iterations of what we now recognize as pizza weren't the elaborate creations you see today. They were flatbreads, simple and unadorned, often topped with a drizzle of olive oil, a sprinkle of salt, or a few herbs. They were fast food before fast food was a concept, readily available from street vendors who cooked them in communal ovens or small, portable brick ovens. These pizzas were the fuel for the working man, a quick, cheap, and filling meal. Then came the tomato. Initially, it was likely chopped and scattered over these flatbreads, perhaps raw, perhaps briefly cooked. Historians still argue whether the earliest cooked tomato sauce on pizza was a deliberate innovation or an accidental discovery born from throwing whatever was on hand onto the dough before baking. Regardless of its exact origin, the combination proved revelatory. The sweetness of the tomato, its tang, its vibrant color, it provided a much-needed burst of flavor and nutrition to an otherwise humble dish. It was cheap, it was abundant, and most importantly, it didn't make you sick. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was energizing. Think of it. You've been working all day, maybe hauling fish from the docks or carrying goods through the labyrinthine streets. Your stomach is rumbling, and you need something quick and satisfying. You see a vendor, perhaps a pizzaiolo with flour dusting his apron, pulling a steaming, fragrant flatbread from a scorching oven. He splashes a spoonful of bright red, slightly chunky sauce over it, maybe a few basil leaves if he's feeling fancy, and hands it to you on a piece of paper, or just folds it in half. The warmth, the aroma, the burst of flavor, it's transformative. It's not just food. It's comfort, it's energy, it's a tiny moment of joy in a challenging day. This burgeoning culinary trend was happening entirely below the radar of high society, while the elite were still wary, clinging to their age-old superstitions about the poison apple. The common folk of Naples were unwittingly, deliciously, dismantling centuries of fear. The sheer volume of consumption in Naples created a critical mass, a kind of collective immunity to the old myths. When you see your neighbor, your friend, your entire community eating something with gusto and not just surviving, but thriving, those ancient fears begin to dissipate like smoke from a wood-fired oven. The interaction between the tomato and the bread was symbiotic. The flatbread provided the perfect, neutral canvas for the tomato's bold flavor, and the tomato, in turn, elevated the simple bread into something special. It wasn't long before specialized pizzaioli began to emerge, refining their craft, experimenting with different toppings, and perfecting the art of the quick, blistering bake. This wasn't just about putting a red fruit on bread. It was about integrating it so completely that it became inseparable from the dish itself. It became the very essence of what a Neapolitan pizza was. You couldn't imagine one without the other, a concept that would have been utterly laughable a mere century prior. It's almost as if the tomato itself, after centuries of being misunderstood and maligned, finally found its true calling, its perfect partner in crime, right here in this lively, unpretentious city. It was the ultimate culinary Cinderella story, only instead of a glass slipper, it found its destiny on a disk of dough. You're standing in an early American garden, the sun warm on your back, the air thick with the scent of fertile earth and blooming herbs. Before you, nestled amongst the vibrant green foliage, hangs a cluster of plump crimson fruits. They're undeniably beautiful, almost jewel-like, catching the light with a seductive sheen. But your stomach clenches. Every instinct, every whisper of folklore passed down through generations screams one undeniable truth. These are not food. These are the love apples, the wolf peaches, the very things that brought strange, wasting illnesses to the wealthy in Europe, remember. You're standing there eyeing that plump red fruit, and every fiber of your being is screaming, "Do not touch. You probably won't survive this." Even as Neapolitan chefs were creating culinary masterpieces around the tomato, transforming it into the vibrant, tangy base of the world's most famous pizzas. Across the vast expanse of the Atlantic, in the burgeoning United States, the tomato remained firmly entrenched in the realm of suspicion, while some brave souls in southern Europe had begun to tentatively embrace it. America held onto its reservations with a tenacity that would make a stubborn mule look agreeable. It wasn't just caution. It was a deep-seated, almost genetic distrust that persisted well into the 19th century. The idea that this beautiful fruit, so closely related to deadly nightshade, could possibly be safe to eat was, for many, simply unfathomable. You'd think by the early 1800s, with all the scientific advancements and the sheer amount of global communication happening, that this particular fear would have, withered on the vine. But nope, not in America. Imagine trying to convince your neighbors that this pretty garden ornamental, which many still believe to be purely decorative or, worse, overtly toxic, was actually delicious. It was like trying to convince a cat to enjoy a bath, an uphill battle, fraught with hisses and indignant stares. The whispers of the poison apple myth had crossed the ocean with the early settlers, carried not on pirate ships, but on the very lips of those seeking a new beginning, embedding itself into the cultural fabric of the young nation. For generations, grandmothers would warn their grandchildren against even touching the fruit, let alone consuming it. If it looked that much like the berries on the dreaded bittersweet nightshade, then surely it must share its deadly secrets, right? One of the mainstream historical facts that stands out in this period is the efforts of prominent figures like Thomas Jefferson. Yes, the third president of the United States, known for his intellect and agricultural curiosity, was an early adopter of the tomato. He cultivated them at Monticello as early as 1781 and included them in his gardens, even serving them to guests. Now, you might imagine this would be enough to sway public opinion, given Jefferson's standing. But no, not quite. It was often viewed more as an eccentric hobby of an enlightened individual rather than a ringing endorsement for widespread consumption. "Oh, that Mr. Jefferson," you can almost hear them murmur, always experimenting with those peculiar plants. His influence, while significant in many areas, couldn't single-handedly dismantle a century of ingrained fear. The skepticism wasn't just anecdotal. Early American agricultural texts and botanical manuals often listed the tomato with caveats, if they even mentioned it as a foodstuff at all. Some described it as a purgative or emetic, something to be used medicinally, if at all, to induce vomiting or bowel movements. Hardly an appealing culinary endorsement. It certainly wasn't marketed as a delightful addition to your breakfast toast. You wouldn't find it proudly displayed in the produce aisle next to the apples and corn, which, by contrast, were greeted with open arms and enthusiastic stomachs. It seems Americans were far more comfortable with fruits that didn't have a family tree full of botanical delinquents. And then there's the quirky, perhaps a bit melodramatic, tidbit of Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson. In 1820, in Salem, New Jersey, he reportedly stood before a crowd on the courthouse steps and publicly ate a basket of tomatoes. He was trying to prove their safety, a dramatic culinary declaration that aimed to dispel the prevailing fear. The crowd, it said, expected him to drop dead on the spot, perhaps seizing up or turning a ghastly shade of green. But he didn't. He finished the tomatoes, presumably bowed, and walked away unscathed. This moment, while perhaps exaggerated in retelling, became a celebrated anecdote, a pivotal turning point for some, but it still didn't instantly convert the entire nation. It was a step, not a sprint, towards acceptance. People didn't suddenly wake up the next morning thinking, "Oh, if Colonel Johnson ate it, I guess it's fine for my stew." More likely it was, "Well, he didn't die, but I'm still not taking any chances." The social and cultural reasons for this prolonged American hesitancy are complex. It wasn't just the lingering fear of lead poisoning from pewter plates common folk in America, like their European counterparts, often used simpler earthenware or wooden dishes, inadvertently avoiding the lead issue. Yet the fear persisted. It became a matter of cultural identity, almost. A food for the poor, perhaps, or a strange, foreign import that wasn't to be trusted. While immigrants from southern Europe, particularly Italians, started arriving and bringing their culinary traditions with them, they slowly, almost secretively, introduced the tomato into their communities. It began to appear in their home gardens and their small, ethnic markets, a quiet defiance of the mainstream skepticism. But for the average American household, the tomato was still very much an outsider. Historians still debate whether the visual similarity to other deadly nightshades or the powerful, enduring European superstitions played a larger role in cementing American aversion to the tomato. Was it simply a slow, organic process of cultural assimilation, or was there a specific moment or discovery that finally shifted the tide? Perhaps it was a combination of factors. The slow trickle of positive reports from individuals like Jefferson and Johnson, the undeniable versatility of the fruit as it started to be adopted into various immigrant cuisines, and the eventual rise of commercial canning, which made it a convenient, year-round staple. The shift from ornamental curiosity to edible staple was glacial. For decades, the tomato was often relegated to the flower garden, its vibrant color appreciated for its aesthetic appeal, not its flavor. Imagine a world where basil and oregano were common, but the very heart of Italian-American cooking was still viewed as a potential poison. It's almost comical, isn't it? The idea of a pizza without tomato sauce would be unthinkable today. Yet for a very long time in America, that was the reality. You'd think the pure joy of a good marinara would be enough to convert anyone, but apparently, fear is a surprisingly effective palate cleanser. Even the medical community, often at the forefront of dispelling myths, was slow to universally embrace the tomato. Old prejudices died hard, and the scientific understanding of nutrition and toxicology was still in its relative infancy. It took time, continued experimentation, and the sheer force of culinary will to finally peel away the layers of fear and superstition surrounding the love apple. The stage was set, not for a sudden revolution, but for a slow, simmering acceptance that would finally allow the tomato to claim its rightful place in American kitchens, one cautious bite at a time. The year is 1820, and you're standing in the bustling market square of Salem, New Jersey. The air is thick with a nervous, almost breathless anticipation, a hush settling over the usually boisterous crowd. Sunlight glints off the steeple of the local church, and a gentle breeze rustles the leaves on the ancient oak in the center of the square. But no one is looking at the church or the tree today. All eyes are fixed on a man, a figure of almost mythic calm, standing before a gathered throng of skeptics, whispers of doom circulating like wildfire. This isn't a political rally, nor a traveling circus act, though the tension in the atmosphere feels uncannily similar to both. No, this is something far more audacious, far more dangerous, at least in the eyes of everyone present. This is a culinary showdown, a gastronomic gamble, a public experiment designed to prove a point so revolutionary it borders on madness. You lean in, craning your neck just like everyone else, to get a better view of Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson. He stands there, a man of quiet determination, his gaze steady, his resolve unwavering. Around him, the murmurs are frantic. "He's going to die," someone whispers, a nervous giggle escaping their lips. "They say it curdles your blood," another adds, crossing themselves instinctively. You can almost feel the collective dread, the morbid fascination of a crowd gathered to witness what they believe will be a slow, agonizing demise. And honestly, if you'd been living in America for the past couple of centuries, absorbing every cautionary tale about the wolf peach, you'd probably feel the same way. In fact, sitting here comfortably, knowing what we know now, you still have to admit, if you'd been in that crowd, convinced of the tomato's deadly nature, you probably wouldn't survive the sheer anxiety of watching him take that first bite. Your heart would simply give out. Colonel Johnson, though, is unfazed. He has seen the lingering skepticism in America, the way the love apple, as some optimistically called it, was still relegated to decorative status, a pretty but poisonous garden ornament. Remember those wealthy Europeans who fell ill, not from the fruit itself, but from its acidic reaction with their lead-laced pewter plates. That crucial, insidious detail had largely been lost in the transatlantic journey, leaving only the fear, the unfounded certainty that the tomato was a harbinger of sickness and death. It was an enduring superstition, a whisper of poison clinging to its very name, passed down through generations. He knew it was time for a dramatic, undeniable counterargument, a performance designed to shatter centuries of baseless fear. Beside him, on a small, sturdy wooden table, rests a basket overflowing with ripe, red tomatoes. They gleam in the sunlight, plump and inviting, yet to the onlookers, they are objects of terror, fruits of the forbidden. These aren't just any tomatoes. Historians still argue whether these were the smaller, wilder varieties or the larger, more cultivated ones already making inroads in parts of southern Europe. But whatever their specific lineage, they represented the ultimate challenge to the deeply entrenched belief system of the American public. You can practically hear the collective gasp as Johnson reaches into the basket. He picks one, a perfectly round specimen, its skin taut and unblemished. He holds it up for all to see, a silent, defiant gesture. The crowd holds its breath. A fly buzzes lazily past your ear, the only sound breaking the absolute silence. He brings the tomato to his lips. There's no hesitation, no outward sign of fear. He takes a bite, a deliberate, resonant crunch that echoes in the stillness. Juice dribbles down his chin, a crimson testament to his audacity. You can almost taste the tart sweetness from where you stand, a flavor that to most gathered there signifies impending doom. One bite, then another. He chews, he swallows, he wipes his mouth with a handkerchief. He doesn't convulse. He doesn't foam at the mouth. His skin doesn't turn green, nor does he collapse in a heap, clutching his stomach in agony. He looks fine, more than fine, in fact. He looks resolute, triumphant. The crowd remains transfixed. They wait. Surely the poison is slow-acting. It will seize him any minute now. But Colonel Johnson, with a flair for the dramatic that would make any modern-day influencer blush, doesn't stop at one. He picks up another, and another. He continues to eat methodically, deliberately, until the basket filled with what eyewitnesses later described as a truly impressive quantity of fruit is empty. He stands before them, alive, breathing, and remarkably, seemingly healthier than most of the pale-faced onlookers. It's a show of sheer willpower and botanical faith, a public spectacle that defies all conventional wisdom of the time. A nervous cough breaks the spell, then a tentative murmur. It spreads, growing into a low hum, then a cacophony of excited chatter. People begin to shift, their faces slowly transforming from abject horror to dawning comprehension. Could it be? Could they have been wrong all this time? This wasn't some scientific paper written in Latin, indecipherable to the common person. This was a man, a respected figure, putting his life on the line. This wasn't a rumor whispered over fences. It was a public, undeniable performance. It was a mic drop 19th century style, proving that the dreaded wolf peach was, in fact, just a very misunderstood fruit. This brave bite in Salem didn't immediately turn the tide across all of America, mind you. Superstitions, especially those with such a long and twisted history, are stubbornly difficult to eradicate completely. There were still pockets of resistance, still people who clung to the old beliefs, muttering about delayed effects or individual immunities. It's like trying to convince your great-aunt that her homemade fruitcake won't magically give you super strength if you eat it on a Tuesday. Some beliefs are just too deeply ingrained. But Johnson's demonstration was a pivotal moment, a widely reported event that provided tangible, undeniable proof that the tomato was, indeed, edible. It chipped away at the foundation of fear, exposing the rotten core of misinformation that had kept this delicious fruit out of American kitchens for far too long. It was the first resounding bell in the death knell of the poison apple myth in the New World. You stand there, a phantom in the buzzing crowd, the afternoon sun warm on your imaginary shoulders. The echoes of a collective gasp still hang in the air, a silent testament to the drama that just unfolded on the Salem courthouse steps. Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, a man whose courage in the face of what was then considered certain death would make even the bravest among you reconsider their life choices. And let's be honest, you probably wouldn't survive this kind of stunt today without an ambulance on standby, has just consumed an entire basket of love apples. He's still standing, still breathing, not frothing at the mouth, or turning a shade of ghastly green. The wolf peach, the supposedly deadly nightshade, has been swallowed whole, and the sky hasn't fallen. This wasn't a magic trick, of course, nor was it an instant revolution. The ingrained fear, centuries old, wouldn't vanish with a single audacious bite, no matter how dramatic. But as you watch the dispersal of the onlookers, there murmurs a slow, spreading ripple. You sense a shift. It's subtle, like the almost imperceptible turning of a massive ship, but the tide is undeniably beginning to turn for the tomato in America. Before Johnson's performance, the tomato's role in American society was largely decorative, relegated to ornamental gardens, its vibrant hues appreciated for their beauty, not their taste. You'd see them gracing parlors, perhaps, or hanging in conservatories, but never on a dinner plate. The prevailing wisdom, fueled by those earlier unfortunate incidents with lead-laced pewter, remember how the acidic fruit tragically turned the aristocrats' feasts into slow poisonings, painted it as a harbinger of doom. Even in the early 19th century, a significant portion of the American populace clung to the belief that to eat a tomato was to invite sickness, if not death. It's hard to imagine now, isn't it? A world without ketchup, without pizza night, without that essential slice on your burger. It's almost as unthinkable as going a day without complaining about something on the internet. Johnson's public consumption acted as a powerful counter-narrative, a live-action debunking of a deeply entrenched myth. His survival, day after day, week after week, was the irrefutable evidence people needed. It wasn't about scientific papers or botanical classifications. It was about seeing a respected figure do it and live. This wasn't an overnight sensation, though. Imagine trying to convince your great-grandparents that kale was good for them. Multiply that resistance by 100, add a dash of genuine fear, and you get the American aversion to tomatoes in the early 1800s. The initial shift wasn't a rush to plant acres of tomatoes, but rather a cautious, experimental foray by a few brave souls. Farmers, ever the pragmatists, began to notice that while Johnson wasn't dead, neither were others who, emboldened by his act, started to try the fruit themselves. You might have seen small patches appearing in kitchen gardens, a single plant nestled among the beans and corn, tended with a mixture of curiosity and lingering apprehension. Your neighbor might tentatively offer you a small, ripe fruit, watching your reaction like a hawk, ready to call for the doctor at the first sign of a twitch. This gradual adoption started regionally, often in areas with strong agricultural traditions, or those influenced by European immigrants who, particularly from southern Europe, Remember how Italy and Spain had begun to embrace the tomato for centuries before America had already integrated tomatoes into their diets. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this slow shift is the increasing appearance of tomato recipes in American cookbooks from the 1830s onwards. Prior to this, they were virtually absent. Suddenly, you begin to see instructions for tomato sauces, stews, and even pies, indicating a growing acceptance beyond mere curiosity. These early recipes, often quite simple, focused on disguising the fruit's strangeness or cooking it down to break its perceived potency. It was less about celebrating its fresh flavor and more about rendering it safe. It's a bit like when you first tried sushi, probably covered in enough soy sauce and wasabi to mask any actual fish taste, just to prove you could do it. The increasing cultivation of tomatoes followed this hesitant culinary exploration. From scattered backyard experiments, commercial cultivation slowly began to expand. You would observe small plots growing into larger fields, especially in warmer climates where the plant thrived. The perception that the tomato was merely an ornamental plant started to erode as its edibility became undeniable. Nurseries began to advertise tomato seeds with less caution, and markets, once wary, found a slow but steady demand for the once feared fruit. However, the path was not without its quirky tidbits and resistance. For instance, even as late as the 1840s, some almanacs and agricultural guides still issued warnings about the tomato's potential toxicity, often citing anecdotal evidence or simply repeating the old myths. You might have read a passage advising against eating them raw, or suggesting that they be boiled for hours to destroy their virulence. It's like when your aunt still insists on turning off all the lights during a thunderstorm, just in case, even though you've explained electricity 1,000 times. There was also a persistent belief in some regions that tomatoes were an aphrodisiac, leading to them being called love apples, a name that, ironically, fueled some of the initial aristocratic experimentation and subsequent lead poisoning, proving that sometimes love is poison, especially if it's served on pewter. The increase in consumption wasn't just about fresh tomatoes. The canning industry, still in its infancy in the early to mid-19th century, played a pivotal role. The ability to preserve tomatoes meant they could be enjoyed year-round, extending their reach beyond the growing season. You would have seen early canning operations, perhaps small-scale family affairs, jarring tomatoes for winter, ensuring a supply of the new fruit even when the gardens were barren. This preservation not only made them more accessible, but also, perhaps subconsciously, made them seem safer. If they could be processed and stored, surely they weren't inherently deadly. Historians still argue whether Johnson's demonstration was the singular catalytic event, or merely the most visible turning point in a process already underway due to other influences, such as increased immigration from tomato-eating cultures and the general spirit of agricultural experimentation of the era. Some scholars lean towards Johnson being a celebrity endorser who merely accelerated an inevitable trend, while others credit him with directly shattering the superstition for a wide American audience. You might wonder, as you drift into slumber, if one man's brave bite truly changed a nation's palate, or if it was simply the perfectly timed spark that ignited a slow-burning fuse. Regardless of the precise weight of Johnson's influence, the trajectory was clear. By the mid-19th century, the tomato was firmly on its way to becoming an American culinary staple. You would witness its transformation from a feared, decorative curiosity to a beloved ingredient, cultivated widely and consumed with relish. The fear of the wolf peach was slowly, steadily, replaced by the joy of the juicy, versatile fruit we know and love today. The seeds of change, literally and figuratively, had been sown. You stand on the precipice of a new dawn, not just for the humble tomato, but for human understanding itself. The clinking of pewter plates, once a sinister soundtrack to aristocratic suffering, has faded into the distant echo of a mistaken past. Colonel Johnson's dramatic bite, that theatrical act of defiance in the New Jersey courthouse, has finally started to chip away at centuries of unfounded fear. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief, a slow, gentle exhale that begins to clear the fog of superstition. For a long time, the tomato was simply there. An object of suspicion, then curiosity, then a tentative culinary experiment. But now, as the 19th century gracefully bows out and the 20th century flexes its nascent scientific muscles, something truly revolutionary begins to unfold. We're talking about more than just taste. We're talking about the very essence of why you eat what you eat. You're about to delve into the microscopic miracles nestled within that ruby skin, a journey that reveals just how profoundly wrong everyone had been. And frankly, considering the sheer number of vitamins and antioxidants we're about to discuss, it's a wonder anyone survived without them in their diet. You probably won't survive this journey of scientific discovery without craving a good marinara. The transition from culinary acceptance to nutritional appreciation wasn't instantaneous, of course. It was a gradual, painstaking process, much like trying to convince a cat to enjoy a bath. Scientists, no longer content with merely classifying plants by their superficial similarities to known poisons, began to probe deeper. They looked beyond the plant's family tree and into its very chemical composition. This was the era where biochemistry began to truly blossom, moving beyond the crude observations of past centuries. Analytical chemistry, with its ever more sophisticated techniques, started to dissect foods, breaking them down into their fundamental components. They weren't just looking at the plant's external appearance, they were peering into its molecular soul. Imagine the early nutritionists, armed with their rudimentary lab equipment, like culinary detectives trying to solve a very delicious mystery. They knew that scurvy, a truly nasty disease that plagued sailors, could be cured by citrus fruits. This was one of the earliest, clearest demonstrations that certain foods contained essential, life-giving substances. From there, the hunt was on. Vitamins, a term coined in the early 20th century by the Polish biochemist Casimir Funk, a name that sounds like a secret agent from a very nerdy spy movie, became the buzzword. These vital amines were tiny, elusive compounds, present in minute quantities, yet absolutely crucial for health. The tomato, once vilified, started to come under this new, discerning gaze. One of the first significant discoveries regarding the tomato's intrinsic goodness revolved around its impressive vitamin C content. Yes, the very same ascorbic acid that kept sailors from losing their teeth and gumming their hardtack. While not as concentrated as an orange or a bell pepper, a substantial serving of tomatoes could certainly contribute significantly to your daily vitamin C needs. This was a mainstream historical fact that quietly, steadily, began to build the tomato's new reputation. It wasn't just safe, it was actively beneficial. This realization was a quiet revolution, a whisper of truth that began to drown out the centuries of screaming falsehoods. But the story of the tomato's nutritional prowess doesn't stop at vitamin C. Oh no. That's just the appetizer. As the decades progressed and scientific instruments grew sharper, researchers began to uncover an entire symphony of beneficial compounds. Enter the carotenoids. You might know them as the pigments that give carrots their vibrant orange hue. In tomatoes, the star carotenoid is lycopene. Now, lycopene is a bit of a show-off. It's the powerful antioxidant responsible for the tomato's rich red color. Think of antioxidants as tiny, microscopic superheroes, capes and all, zipping around your body, bravely battling what are called free radicals. These free radicals are unstable molecules that can damage your cells, leading to all sorts of unpleasantness, from aging to various diseases. Lycopene, in particular, proved to be an exceptionally potent antioxidant, more so than many others. It was a discovery that truly cemented the tomato's place in the pantheon of superfoods. Here's a quirky tidbit. It turns out that processing tomatoes, cooking them into sauces, pastes, or ketchups, actually increases the bioavailability of lycopene. That means your body can absorb and utilize more of this incredible compound from cooked tomatoes than from raw ones. So all those Italian chefs who have been simmering tomato sauces for centuries weren't just making delicious food. They were, unknowingly, optimizing its nutritional punch. It's almost as if they had a secret, ancient knowledge passed down through generations, predating modern science. Or maybe they just liked the taste better. Historians still argue whether the culinary preference for cooked tomatoes influenced the eventual scientific understanding, or if the scientific understanding retroactively justified the cooking methods. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario, only with more pomodoro. Beyond lycopene and vitamin C, the tomato is a veritable treasure chest of other essential nutrients. You'll find vitamin K, crucial for blood clotting, and potassium, an electrolyte vital for heart function and maintaining fluid balance. There's also a good dose of folate, important for cell growth and function, and various B vitamins. Fiber, too, makes its appearance, aiding in digestion and keeping things moving along. It's like a multivitamin, but in fruit form, which is arguably much more appealing than swallowing a horse pill. You start to realize with a slight chuckle that humanity spent centuries fearing a food that was, in fact, quietly offering profound health benefits. It's almost ironic, isn't it? The very plant they thought was sending aristocrats to an early grave was actually a tiny, red, edible health clinic. This comprehensive understanding of the tomato's nutritional profile wasn't a single aha moment, but rather the cumulative effort of countless researchers across decades. It required advancements in agricultural science to produce healthier, more consistent crops, improvements in food preservation to make tomatoes accessible year-round, and most importantly, a paradigm shift in medical and dietary thinking. No longer was food merely fuel or a source of pleasure. It was increasingly seen as medicine, as a preventative measure against illness. The tomato, once the wolf peach, had now truly transformed into the love apple, not just for its romantic connotations, but for the profound love and care it showed your insides. The widespread dissemination of this scientific knowledge wasn't instantaneous either. Old habits and old fears die hard. But gradually, through public health campaigns, dietary guidelines, and the relentless march of scientific education, the truth about the tomato became undeniable. It moved from being an exotic curiosity to a dietary staple, lauded not just for its versatility in the kitchen, but for its undeniable contribution to human health. You now understand that when you bite into a ripe tomato, You're not just tasting the sun and the soil. You're ingesting a carefully calibrated cocktail of compounds designed to keep you humming along. It's a testament to how far we've come, from fearing the plant that grew in the dirt to celebrating the science that uncovered its hidden power. And as you drift deeper into this story, you realize the quiet revolution of knowledge is often the most potent of all. You wake up, a gentle morning light filters through your window, and you reach for that crisp, juicy tomato sliced perfectly for your breakfast. No fear, no trepidation, just pure, unadulterated enjoyment. But remember that chilling whisper from centuries past. The one that painted this ruby orb as a harbinger of doom. The one that said, with a shake of the head and a knowing glance, "You probably won't survive this if you dare bite into the wolf peach." Well, dear listener, here you are, very much alive, enjoying your tomato. And that, in itself, is a testament to the quiet revolution of scientific understanding that eventually peeled back the layers of fear, revealing the truth, which, as it turns out, is far less dramatic than lead poisoning and ancient superstitions. You see, modern science, with its powerful microscopes and complex chemical analyses, has thoroughly dissected the very compounds that once cast such a long, dark shadow over the entire nightshade family. We're talking about glycoalkaloids. It sounds like something out of a mad scientist's lab, doesn't it? But these are perfectly natural compounds, synthesized by plants as a built-in defense mechanism. Think of them as the plant's tiny, chemical bodyguard, deterring pests and pathogens. They're found in varying amounts across the Solanaceae family. That's the scientific name for nightshades, including our beloved tomatoes, but also potatoes, eggplants, and bell peppers. The most well-known glycoalkaloid in potatoes is solanine, while in tomatoes it's primarily tomatine. Now, for centuries, the mere mention of these compounds might have sent a shiver down your spine, but today, you understand the nuance. You're not dealing with some potent, instantly lethal toxin when you pick a ripe tomato. The concentration of tomatine in a fully ripened tomato is incredibly low, so minute that it poses virtually no risk to human health. It's highest in the green, unripe tomatoes, and even more so in the leaves, stems, and roots of the plant. This is why you probably wouldn't munch on a tomato leaf for a snack, though if you did, it might just give you a bit of a stomach ache, not a one-way ticket to the afterlife. It's the plant's way of saying, "Hey, I'm not quite ready to be eaten yet." Or, "These parts are for photosynthesis, not your salad." The actual minimal risks of consuming raw tomatoes, or even cooked ones, are so negligible that they almost don't bear mentioning, except for the lingering echoes of past fears. For the vast majority of people, tomatoes are a nutritional powerhouse, packed with vitamins, antioxidants, and a whole host of good-for-you compounds. The only scenario where you might feel any ill effect from tomatine in tomatoes would be if you ate an absurd, literally impossible amount of unripe, green tomatoes, perhaps hundreds in one sitting. And even then, you'd likely experience only mild gastrointestinal discomfort, not the dramatic, debilitating symptoms of lead poisoning that plagued the aristocracy of old. Remember how their fancy pewter plates were the real villains in that story, stealthily leaching lead into their acidic tomato sauce. The tomato was just an innocent bystander, caught in a very expensive, very metallic crossfire. Modern scientific understanding has also delved into the specifics of how these compounds interact with the human body. We know that, in high enough doses, which, again, you simply won't get from ripe tomatoes, glycoalkaloids can disrupt cell membranes, leading to symptoms like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches, and in extremely rare and severe cases, neurological effects. But the critical difference between the theory and your breakfast tomato is the dosage. It's like the difference between a drop of water and a tsunami. Both are water, but one is refreshing. The other, well, you get the picture. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this shift in perception is the rigorous scientific process of isolating, identifying, and quantifying plant compounds like glycolcaloids. This meticulous work truly kicked into high gear in the 20th century, moving beyond observational fears to precise chemical analysis. Scientists painstakingly extracted these compounds, tested their effects, and determined safe consumption levels, systematically dismantling the poison myth with hard data. This wasn't just about tomatoes, mind you. It was part of a broader scientific awakening to the complex chemistry of the natural world. Now for a quirky tidbit. While some glycolcaloids can be toxic, some traditional medicine systems around the world have, for centuries, recognized and even intentionally utilized very small, controlled amounts of certain nightshade plants for specific therapeutic purposes. It's a testament to ancient people's keen observational skills and their understanding that the dose makes the poison. They weren't using ripe tomatoes, of course, but perhaps other parts or related species, showcasing an intuitive grasp of biochemistry long before the term was even invented. Imagine trying to explain chromatography to an ancient shaman, only for them to nod sagely and say, "Ah yes, the spirit of the root is strong, but in balance." Of course, the human body is a marvelously complex and varied machine. Scientists still debate the full implications of trace amounts of glycolcaloids on long-term human health for exceptionally sensitive individuals. While the risk is generally considered minimal for everyone, there's always that tiny fraction of the population with unique biological responses or very specific allergies. These aren't cases of poisoning in the traditional sense, but rather individual sensitivities, much like someone might be sensitive to strawberries or gluten. It's a subtle distinction, but an important one, differentiating a widespread toxic threat from a personal dietary consideration. So, as you enjoy your tomato today, free from the specter of the wolf peach, you can appreciate the journey this unassuming fruit has taken. From feared killer to beloved kitchen staple. It's a journey propelled not just by brave public demonstrations or culinary ingenuity, but by the steady, unglamorous work of scientists, meticulously uncovering the truths hidden within nature's chemistry. They've given you the knowledge, and now the freedom to savor every bite without a single whispered fear of "you probably won't survive this." You absolutely will. 19. Tomatoes' global gastronomy. Imagine a world without tomato paste, without the glorious burst of a sun-ripened cherry tomato in a summer salad, without the sweet tang of ketchup on your fries. A truly terrifying thought, isn't it? You might even gasp. Take a deep breath. You probably wouldn't survive a day in a world stripped of its tomato-y goodness. Your palate, accustomed to the rich umami and vibrant acidity of this once feared fruit, would be utterly lost. And yet this omnipresence, this undeniable culinary royalty, was not a given. Not by a long shot. From being the subject of public dares and fearful whispers, the wolf peach had begun its quiet, then thunderous, conquest of global palates. Remember Colonel Johnson, bravely munching his way through a basket of them, defying the grim reaper of lead poisoning. Well, his brave bite and countless smaller, more private acts of culinary courage slowly chipped away at the old superstitions. But it wasn't just a change of heart that propelled the tomato from garden curiosity to kitchen cornerstone. It was a perfect storm of practicality, evolving tastes, and, frankly, good old-fashioned deliciousness. Consider, for a moment, the humble ketchup. Not the fermented fish concoction that inspired its name, mind you, but the bright red, sweet and sour elixir that coats hot dogs and makes French fries feel complete. The widespread commercialization of tomato ketchup in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, especially by companies like Heinz, transformed a seasonal fruit into a year-round global condiment. This wasn't just about taste. It was about preservation. Suddenly, you could enjoy the essence of summer tomatoes even in the dead of winter, long after the last fresh fruit had vanished from the vines. It was a marvel of industrial ingenuity and a testament to the tomato's newfound commercial viability. Before long, you'd find bottles of it on diner counters from New York to Nome, a clear signal that the tomato had truly arrived. But it wasn't just American ingenuity that put the tomato on the world map. Look to Italy, the land where the pizza became a culinary icon. You might think tomatoes and pasta sauce have been entwined since time immemorial, but as we've seen, the love affair was a relatively recent development. Yet once embraced, it became an indissoluble bond. The vibrancy of San Marzano tomatoes transforming into rich, slow-simmered ragus, or the simple, fresh burst of pomodoro sauce clinging to al dente pasta. These dishes became synonymous with Italian cuisine itself. It's hard to imagine spaghetti without that rich, red foundation, isn't it? Or a Neapolitan pizza without its crown of crushed, sun-ripened tomatoes. This culinary alchemy, transforming the one-suspect fruit into the very soul of a national cuisine, is perhaps the tomato's greatest triumph. Across the globe, in the vibrant culinary landscape of India, the tomato found another enthusiastic home. From the rich, complex gravies of butter chicken to the tangy depth of a South Indian sambar, the tomato provides essential body, color, and sour notes. It's not merely an ingredient. It's a foundational element, often pureed into a smooth base or chopped finely to release its juices, binding spices and vegetables into harmonious, flavorful wholes. You'd be hard-pressed to find an Indian curry house today that doesn't rely heavily on the tomato's versatile profile. It was absorbed into ancient culinary traditions with remarkable ease, a testament to its chameleon-like ability to adapt and enhance. And then there's the salsa, that fresh, zesty cornerstone of Mexican cuisine. The very word for tomato in Nahuatl, zitamatl, reminds us of its Mesoamerican origins, a full-circle moment from its fearful arrival in Europe. Whether it's pico de gallo, a vibrant mix of chopped tomatoes, onions, and cilantro, or a smoky roasted salsa, the tomato brings a freshness and acidity that cuts through richness and awakens the palate. You can almost taste the sunshine in every bite, a far cry from the pallid, suspicious fruit Europeans once eyed with such trepidation. And it wasn't just the established culinary titans embracing it. Think of the humble but ubiquitous curry pastes in Southeast Asia, the rich stews of North Africa, or the vibrant sauces of the Middle East. The tomato, in various forms, has found its way into countless regional variations, often becoming an essential binder and flavor enhancer. Its success wasn't merely about taste, but also about its robust nature. It could be canned, transported across vast oceans, and grown in diverse climates, making it an economic boon. This agricultural adaptability, combined with its culinary versatility, made it an unstoppable force, a truly global commodity that fueled trade and nourished populations. You might even say it became the edible equivalent of a global ambassador, speaking the universal language of deliciousness. Now, here's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. While the tomato was gaining culinary ground, it was also finding its way into drinks. Beyond the familiar Bloody Mary, which you might sip at brunch, perhaps after a night of questionable decisions, there was a brief, curious trend in the early 20th century for tomato juice cocktails that weren't alcoholic. People were actually drinking plain tomato juice, sometimes with a dash of celery salt as a health tonic. Imagine a chilled glass of what looked suspiciously like blood, advertised as a refreshing pick-me-up. It really hammers home how much its image had shifted from poison to panacea. You'd probably think it was a prank if someone offered you a plain glass today, wouldn't you? The adaptability of the tomato is truly its superpower. It can be a fruit, a vegetable, a sauce base, a thickener, a souring agent, a sweetener, a colorant. It's equally at home raw in a salad, cooked down into a rich sauce, sun-dried for intense flavor, or even candied, though that's a less common use now. Thankfully, you're welcome. Its unique balance of glutamic acid, sugars, and organic acids gives it that incredible umami depth, making everything it touches taste richer, more complex. It's like the quiet superhero of the kitchen, enhancing every dish without hogging the spotlight. Unless, of course, you're making a caprese salad, in which case it's the undisputed star, flanked by its trusty sidekicks, mozzarella and basil. This global culinary takeover wasn't without its nuanced beginnings. Historians still argue whether it was the sheer force of Italian-American immigration bringing their beloved sauces to the world, or the strategic industrialization of canning that truly propelled the tomato into every pantry. Perhaps it was a combination of factors, a slow-burning fuse that ignited into a global gastronomic explosion. What's clear is that the fear, the wolf peach stigma, eventually faded into a quaint historical footnote, replaced by an almost evangelical fervor for the fruit. Today, you find tomatoes thriving in every conceivable climate, from the glass houses of Holland to the sun-baked fields of California. New varieties are constantly being developed, enhancing sweetness, disease resistance, or even creating odd shapes and colors just for fun. You can pick up a can of crushed tomatoes from Italy, a bottle of chili sauce from Thailand, or a jar of salsa from Mexico, all featuring this remarkable fruit as their star. Its journey from suspicious ornamental to global culinary cornerstone is a testament to human curiosity, resilience, and, ultimately, our insatiable desire for deliciousness. It went from being something that you might fear to something you couldn't imagine living without. And that, my friend, is quite the transformation story. And as you drift deeper into this history, you can almost taste the sweet, tangy legacy of the tomato on your tongue, a truly comforting thought. You find yourself in a world utterly saturated with the crimson glow of the tomato. It's in your pasta sauce, your ketchup, your salsa. It's sliced onto your sandwich, diced into your salad, and perhaps even enjoyed straight from the vine. Imagine, if you can, a time when this ubiquitous fruit, this symbol of summer and flavor, was viewed with abject horror. A literal wolf peach capable of poisoning you where you sat. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? Like something out of a medieval fairy tale where you definitely won't survive the next bite of a suspiciously red apple. But for centuries, this was the deeply ingrained reality for many. A fascinating, circuitous journey born of fear and misunderstanding. A testament to how easily perception, rather than truth, can shape our most intimate relationship with food. So here we are, at the very culmination of our story, reflecting on the vast chasm between ancient suspicion and modern culinary affection. You've seen how its distant nightshade relatives painted it with a brush of dread, how botanists cautiously catalogued it with deadly kin, and how its slow, timid journey across oceans positioned it first as a mere ornamental curiosity. Remember those aristocratic afflictions, the mysterious illnesses that struck down the wealthy, cementing the tomato's toxic reputation, while all along, the true culprit was lurking in plain sight. The insidious lead in their pewter tableware, the acidic juice, dutifully leaching poison, turned every daring bite into a slow, silent threat, while the common folk, munching happily from wooden bowls, were blissfully unaware of their fortuitous immunity. The fear, you realize, was remarkably tenacious. It clung to the tomato like a shadow, spreading through supper superstitions and cautionary tales, especially reinforced by its rather unfortunate scientific name, Lycopersicum esculentum, the edible wolf peach, an undeniable nod to its dark, mystical associations, even as early garden experimentation hinted at its harmless nature, and glimpses of acceptance flickered in sun-drenched southern European kitchens, particularly in Italy and Spain. The global embrace was slow, hesitant. Think of how long it took for pizza, that iconic culinary catalyst from Naples, to truly catapult the tomato from feared fruit to beloved staple. Even in America, long after its initial European journey, the love apple remained suspect. You might recall Colonel Johnson's brave bite in 1820, a public spectacle designed to dispel fear, a dramatic gesture that, while pivotal, didn't instantly convert a continent. It merely opened a crack in the wall of doubt, leading to a gradual shift in perception. A slow, steady increase in cultivation and consumption as the scientific understanding of its rich nutritional benefits, its vitamins and antioxidants, slowly began to emerge. And now, armed with our modern nightshade nuances, you understand the actual minimal risks of glycoalkaloids, the very compounds that once fueled centuries of baseless fear. The tomato, once a pariah, has risen, ascended to a ubiquitous, indispensable ingredient in cuisines worldwide. From the simple ketchup you squirt onto your fries to the complex curries simmering on distant stoves. But the legacy of that initial misconception, that deep-seated fear, echoes even now, softly, subtly. It's in the persistent urban legends about food, the quickness with which we sometimes embrace unverified claims about what's good or bad for us. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in the tomato's toxicity truly stalled its culinary adoption across Europe for as long as commonly believed, or if other cultural and agricultural factors played a larger role. What's undeniable is how a genuine, albeit misunderstood, danger, lead poisoning combined with botanical association and folk superstitions to create a culinary boogeyman that lasted for centuries. It's a powerful reminder that our relationship with food is rarely just about sustenance. It's a tapestry woven with threads of history, culture, fear, and eventually, acceptance. The journey of the tomato, from feared poison to global staple, is a testament to resilience, both of the plant itself and of human curiosity, eventually triumphing over apprehension. Now, as the day's light softens and the world outside begins to hush its busy hum, you can almost feel the gentle weight of all these stories settling around you, like a comforting blanket woven from the past. The tomato's tale, a journey so long and winding, from the shadowy forests of ancient apprehension to the bright fields of modern understanding. reminds us that even the most common things can hold extraordinary histories. It speaks to the slow dance of discovery, the quiet unraveling of mysteries, and the patient process by which fear gives way to familiarity, and then, often, to a quiet, abiding love. Think of how many other stories, just as curious and just as intertwined with human experience, lie hidden within the everyday objects around you, waiting for a moment of quiet reflection, a whispered curiosity to bring them gently to light. The world, you see, is full of such quiet magic, such subtle shifts in perception, changing the ordinary into something quite remarkable. And with each story we share, each understanding we build, we gently peel back another layer of the past, revealing the intricate beauty of how we came to be. So let your thoughts drift now, like a wisp of smoke from a distant kitchen, dissolving into the stillness of the night. Rest deeply, knowing that the most fascinating lessons are often found in the most unexpected places. Sweet dreams.